wrong. It's about how we empower people and inspire people to use their judgment and strive to achieve the sorts of standards that the public expect of people in public life. And that's what the Nolan Principles, enshrined by the Committee on Standards in Public Life 30 years ago, now disseminated remarkably successfully throughout the public sector into different legislatures, into different public services, codes and guidelines all across the public realm. That's what they're supposed to do. That's what the Nolan Principles are there for. So I think we've got a fantastic day of discussion ahead of us. Thank you so much all for joining us. Thank you to everyone who works in and around this landscape, or those of you who've just come because you think these issues are so important. We're going to be hearing from the main parties here in Westminster about their views, discussing also, though, the reality of standards on the front line, because this isn't just a Westminster issue. So we want this to be a day full of discussion and debate, plenty of chances for people here in the room, also everyone joining us online, to share their thoughts, ask questions. And this afternoon we will be breaking out into smaller groups to have discussions around particular themes. So I'm really looking forward to that. So welcome once again, and I'm going to hand over to Doug Chalmers, Chair of CSPL, to say a little bit more about the committee, its 30th anniversary, and then we'll hear, I'm delighted to say, from Sir John Major. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, and good morning, everyone. It really is great as I look around here to see so many familiar faces that have helped in the standards landscape in the time that I have been chair. But also to see new faces that are interested in the standards business and the principles in particular. And I'm especially grateful, if I may say, to Hannah and the IFG team for hosting this event, really making a significant milestone for us in this 30th year of the anniversary of the Principles of Public Life. Now, back in 1995, Lord Nolan set out 7 principles: honesty, objectivity, openness, selflessness, integrity, accountability, and leadership. Now, those are not just words on a page, but they are principles to guide everyone in public office and also to bolster public confidence in those who are elected or appointed to serve them. Now, I personally see these principles as a public good. Why? I believe that they improve predictability and promote better outcomes for society. They increase public confidence and the functioning of our economy. Because, as Hannah touched on, public office is not simply defined by democratic election or taxpayer funding. It is also underpinned by a shared set of values, which for the UK are encapsulated by the 7 principles, which outline the public's expectations of any public sector decision-making process. Now, following these principles doesn't mean that the public will always like the decisions taken, or that the decisions made are perfect every time. But it does give public office holders and the public a framework to consider whether their decisions and conduct are taken in the public interest rather than their own. And if they are lived, trust can build. But if they are not, trust will not build. Now, less well known are the 3 golden threads that Nolan also set out at the time of the principles for maintaining high standards. And those 3 threads are codes of conduct, independent scrutiny, and guidance and education. These threads are vital in complementing the principles. The codes of conduct providing specific guidelines for different roles. Independent scrutiny providing oversight and transparency. And training reinforcing the importance of ethical behaviour. And I think we all agree that maintaining standards requires vigilance and leadership. And today, we'll consider how to do that in our increasingly complex political and public life, where those holding public office have to deal with fast-paced news, social media, myths and disinformation, greater demands for immediate accountability for decision-making, and the polarisation of politics. And of course, all of that against the background and growth of generative AI. Now, society has changed immeasurably since 1995. But the Nolan Principles, those common standards, that public good, have endured. It's important that we keep standards and where the line is drawn under review. In other words, the work of maintaining standards is never done. And today, I'm really looking forward to keeping the debate and discussion about high standards front and centre and sustaining the momentum of that conversation. To kick us off, I am honoured to introduce Sir John Major, former Prime Minister, without whom there would be no Committee on Standards in Public Life, and without the committee, many of the standard structure we take for granted today would simply not exist. No small legacy, Sir John. Please join me in welcoming the Right Honourable Sir John Major.
Well, Doug, thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to say it's a great privilege to be here this morning. I think this conference is timely and a great opportunity to speak about some of the things that I dare say concern us all. If one looks back far enough, for many decades, Britain enjoyed a very good global reputation for being as free of corruption and bad practice as any nation in the world. I think that's a little less true today. And so it's in our national interest to regain that reputation. It's now 30 years, unbelievably, 30 years since that, what I might call a troublesome time, I set up the Nolan Committee to make recommendations on standards in public life. And Nolan set out the 7 principles that Doug mentioned a moment ago. I won't repeat them. They'll appear later. And they remain as relevant and necessary today as they were in the 1990s. The vast majority of elected or career public servants obey those rules, but a minority does not. And when that happens, there must be consequences. Too often, there are not. It's an immense privilege to serve in public life, but that privilege carries with it obligations. Everyone, and perhaps especially if they're elected, should be held to the highest standards of probity. And too often, they are not. The misconduct of a relatively small minority has left trust in public life at too low a level. Scandals in political funding, in the award of honours, in lobbying, in unsavoury behaviour, in bullying, in that wretched saga of partygate, all tell us that a reset is essential. And in recent years, in addition to individual lapses, we have seen governments break or bend the law, ignore the traditional conventions of good conduct, and shield their own colleagues from justified censure. 2 very distinguished and senior advisors to one former Prime Minister resigned due to their recommendations being totally ignored. And such episodes lead to a collapse in respect for politics and for government. What do the public think of that? The public think as follows, that rules apply to them, but do not apply to us being the people in power and with influence. That is a public perception that is very damaging to politics in all its aspects. So the point really is very simple. If public life deceives or misbehaves, or is even thought in any way to be corrupt, this may be shrugged off. But by tolerating bad behaviour, we invite its repetition. And that demeans public life, it betrays trust, and it adds to public cynicism at a time when there is quite sufficient of that around in any event. Now, it has been our past practice in this country to offer guidance on good conduct and trust it will be delivered. That was the Nolan approach. But experience has taught us that no rules can deal with individuals prepared to ignore them, and sometimes sanctions are legitimately required. And there's a problem, of course. The problem in the way we've been doing things. The problem is that to rely on convention leaves loopholes for those with lax scruples. And that being so, it is time to strengthen the safeguards around propriety to ensure our public life is as free from fault as we wish it to be. Now, it is a very healthy British instinct to be sceptical of authority. I like that instinct. But today's scepticism doesn't fairly describe the public mood. A more accurate description would be a mixture of cynicism and disillusion that stretches right across most of our great public institutions. The church, parliament, police, public service and press, all undoubtedly among them. And that is not healthy in our public life. Now, the Committee on Standards in Public Life has reported that social and political trends have coarsened standards. That is true, but it is put too gently. Standards have been undermined by being ignored, by being broken, by public figures who put personal or political interest before public virtue. Now, the main committee specialises in evidence-based inquiries and reviews across all of public life. We're not just talking of the Commons and the Lords, all of public life. Over 30 years, its reputation has grown. It has been in very good hands from the very outset and remains in good hands with Doug. But its reports, like all the bodies that regulate the executive, have remained advisory. Now, I have, in preparation for today, reread those reports over a long period, and I'm full of admiration for the committee's work over the last 3 decades. But several thoughts occur, 3 in particular. As an advisory body, without casework, on balance, it need not be a statutory body. Although I would add, statutory status would strengthen its authority and be a safeguard against any temptation at any stage in the future to abolish the committee. I mentioned in passing its budget is inadequate for its role. But most strikingly, I am baffled that more of its recommendations have not been implemented. One welcome change would add to the committee's authority. It should happen, but it doesn't. The government should respond publicly, not this particular government, governments, should respond publicly and fully to reports within a reasonable time. Too often, they do not. Some have sat on the shelf for a very long time indeed. The ministerial code is the Prime Minister's document. And as matters once stood, he was the prosecuting counsel, jury, and sentencing judge of the standards expected of a minister. Great, you may say, he's got the lot. It's not actually so good for the Prime Minister. It's actually not good for the Prime Minister at all. It often leaves him in an extremely difficult and awkward position. Now, that has now changed. The Prime Minister now has an independent advisor who can initiate, crucial, investigate and report on questionable behaviour, including, if necessary, even that of the Prime Minister himself or herself. The advisor can recommend sanctions on those who break the rules. And if the Prime Minister demurs, either over culpability or over the nature of the sanctions, the advisor can ask for the report to be published in full. Now, that's a good discipline to ensure recommendations are taken seriously and not brushed aside or left to rot on the shelf for so long people have forgotten what it was all about. Now, I am conflicted on whether the independent advisor role should be statutory. On balance, probably not, even though 2 Prime Ministers, to my certain knowledge, have flirted with abolishing the role or leaving it unfilled. However, I think their successors are likely to understand that an advisor with powers can spare a great deal of stress and agony to the Prime Minister. And I hope the Prime Minister understands that. If he does not, I will happily explain it to him. The Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards oversees the Code of Conduct for Members of Parliament and the register of their financial interest. He has high operational independence, rightly so, to investigate complaints about members of Parliament and, where necessary, can refer cases to an expert panel to determine sanctions, or if he chooses, to the Parliamentary Select Committee. That will always be an option for him. These options should preclude the need for a statutory basis. But in stark contrast, I hope the Advisory Committee on Public Appointments, ACOBA, we may say for short, can be put on a statutory basis and given deterrent powers. ACOBA advises upon the propriety of former ministers and senior civil servants taking jobs within 2 years of retirement, or in the case of ministers, 2 years on leaving the Commons. The purpose is to avoid even the suspicion of misuse of privileged information. But as of now, ACOBA has no power of enforcement whatsoever. High-profile figures have ignored its advice. Lord Pickles, the former chairman, has said, I quote Lord Pickles, "There can be no credibility in a system that continues to have no demonstrable or tangible deterrent for non-compliance." In essence, they can be told not to take the job, and they've said, we're doing it, and did. Lord Pickles is right. He named no names, but he could have implicated very senior figures, not all parliamentarians, but some, who broke the rules without consequence. Now, there is a secondary issue concerning middle-ranking civil servants who are below ACOBA's normal eye line. But a steady stream are leaving public service. That in itself is a worrying trend, worth examination. But they're leaving public service for the private sector with little or no oversight. That may not yet provide a serious problem, but it does merit scrutiny of officials who may have been privy to sensitive policy. Well, that often reaches down beyond the highest level to a lower level, and that too needs to be protected. The Public Appointments Commission monitors appointments to large and small public bodies, particularly the large ones we're concerned of, to ensure they're made on merit alone and not by political self-interest or bias. The Commissioner sets up independent assessment panels to vet potential candidates. And from time to time, they have stood their ground bravely in rejecting very, very high-profile candidates, even when favoured by very, very senior politicians, and done so in public. They were right to do so. But their role is not as straightforward as it may seem. The Commissioner can face excessive lobbying by ministers and special advisers, either to add or to remove names from any particular list of potential appointees. Now, typically, human nature being what it is, such representations are likely to be more about political preference than simply a question of ability to do the job. And this undervalues merit. Ultimately, ministers, of course, must be answerable for the final decision. But would it not be far better if lobbying from within government was restricted to the ministers alone, who in case of controversy could be called upon to defend their role publicly and in Parliament? Special advisers, it seems to me, though perhaps I'm very old-fashioned about this, but special advisers are there to advise, not enforce. Although from what I've seen and heard, some have little understanding of that distinction. It would be wise to remind them of it. I would also note that fewer special advisers with more experience of their subject and less personal political ambition might serve the nation a little better. I believe the remit of the House of Lords Advisory Committee, HOLAC for short, I believe their remit needs an upgrade. There is no way in recent years that the appointment of peers passes any form of democratic smell test. Amidst worthy appointments, others seem eye-wateringly inappropriate for the job they are asked to do. It would be reassuring, would it not, if all candidates proposed by party leaders were privately referred to HOLAC to be investigated for suitability and, crucially, for a firm commitment to undertake the work of the upper house. Their nomination should only proceed once HOLAC approval has been sought and obtained. The present vetting system is haphazard. HOLAC examines the propriety and suitability of crossbench peers, but examines only the propriety of political peers nominated by party leaders. To me, this makes absolutely no sense at all. Suitability is important. The House of Lords is a working house, and it has an important role in our Constitution. It could, in practice, do far more than it's actually asked to do, though that is not the subject for this morning. I see no purpose whatsoever in appointing peers unsuitable for the work of the House of Lords or unwilling to do the work of the House of Lords. I understand the tradition of doing so is long-standing, but I do think it is time it stopped. Governments of both main parties have resisted HOLAC's remit to vet the suitability of political peers, for fear, I suspect, that it would limit the Prime Minister's role in recommending them. But frankly, if candidates can't or won't do the job to which they are appointed, then they should not be given the job and a seat in the House of Lords at all. There are also unscrutinised nominees to the Lords, regarded as the Prime Minister's exceptions. They are very senior civil servants. Now, I welcome the top civil servants going to the Lords for a very practical reason. They are highly likely to be most valuable in revising legislation. I would, however, wish to be sure that HOLAC also scrutinises their suitability and commitment. There should be no free pass to becoming a legislator. The quality of public life has been examined not only by the Committee on Standards, but by other interested bodies over recent years. More often than not, I find myself in broad agreement with the recommendations that have been made. I do note, however, that governments often do not. When they respond to reports, often late, they do so with a gift for obfuscation. Recommendations are treated with the utmost respect, short of acceptance. Far too often, and with words of which any circumlocution department would be proud, recommendations are rejected or watered down or kicked into the future or replaced by some muddy alternative. The shelves are full of them in some hidden part of government. I hope the Prime Minister will accept unreservedly that upgrading our armoury against abuse will safeguard propriety in public life. To do so will reflect credit on the government and be a boon to our international reputation. And that propriety matters. When people invest in this country, they do it for many reasons apart from the investment: the quality of our law, the capacity we have to sort out disputes on the law, the fact that we have a government that can be expected to obey the law and not make the law without proper examination over a long period of every clause in the bill. That is an expectation, and it is valuable to us in economic terms as well as in terms of public propriety. Now, I'd just like to touch briefly on three other concerns before we move to questions and comment. The Electoral Commission ought to be a wholly independent body. Our previous government took legislative power to offer them so-called guidance. Yet, to me, the words independent body and government guidance cannot coexist. As yet, I can't see that this has caused any great difficulty, but one day it will, and it could be dealt with before it does. The present government may wish to repeal that power in any forthcoming election bill, and it would be reassuring if they did so. A more serious issue is the funding of politics. This is always problematic, and doubly so when politics is out of favour with the public. The first issue is foreign money. A few weeks ago, it was widely reported that an American multi-billionaire was about to fund a British political party. It didn't happen, nor should it have done. The party concerned would have been a wholly owned subsidiary of foreign money. But we need to refresh protections and close off this pipeline before it becomes a serious political problem. And domestic funding is an issue as well. The political parties are only partly funded by their memberships, less so now than at any time in my political life, because their memberships have shrunk, largely because of public disaffection with the conduct of politics and public life. So the political parties are only partly funded by memberships. Apart from that, they receive public funding from the taxpayer, support from the trade unions, support from corporate or private donors. But today, increasingly, by a very small number of very rich individuals. Now, no one who cares about democratic freedom of action can be comfortable about the way this is developing, however innocent the intent of the donors may be. This is not a new issue, but its salience is growing. Cicero warned of it 2,000 years ago. And the Trump presidency, with its billionaire chorus, reminds us that excessive influence of the mega-rich is incompatible with democratic politics. This is not easy to deal with. In principle, everyone should be free to dispose of their money as they wish, in principle. On the other hand, we must ensure that policy is not for sale to the highest bidder, nor a swift route to any sort of public preferment whatsoever. No one wishes to see a further increase in the public funding of the political parties, and it would be very unpopular. But in the absence of wider sources of income over the next few years, a limit to individual donations per parliament looms on the horizon. It will be bitterly unpopular from the political parties, but it may be democratically necessary unless circumstances begin to evolve in a happier way. One man, one vote is an established principle. It must not be supplanted by one man and his money. I wish to see respect return to Parliament. It doesn't help when time and again policy statements are leaked in detail or announced to the media before a statement is made to the Commons or Lords. I know it happens, but it ought not to be frequent, and it is not acceptable in any conceivable way. It's a disrespect to Parliament, and it needs to stop. If Parliament is not respected by other parts of Parliament, how on earth is it going to be respected by the public at large? It is the public's protection against bad government, or ill-thought-out government, perhaps might be a better way to put it, and we expect governments to obey the conventions of giving Parliament the opportunity to hear about policy before it is passed to the media and to the public at large. One final thought. With a few tweaks, the Nolan system can become an even more formidable protection against bad behaviour. I know that our present government promised a new ethics commission, but so far this seems to be stuck in the long grass. That is not a sarcastic remark. Given current priorities, I'm not surprised that it hasn't yet seen the light of day. Their concerns about propriety are well made, but I personally see no need to reinvent the wheel. We have the Nolan Principles. My very friendly advice to the Prime Minister on this issue would be to stiffen up Nolan and leave the ethics proposal where it is, for he has much bigger issues on his plate to solve than reintroducing that and doing so when it may not be necessary. Earlier, I referred to our widely envied reputation for being free of corruption and bad practice. I regret the slow erosion of that reputation, which we would once have thought to have been indestructible. It's time to reverse this trend before the damage becomes beyond salvage. So let me finish where I started. We need to demonstrate to the people of our own country and far beyond, for the economic reasons I began to set out earlier, that the Nolan principles of selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership, all of those principles of public life are effective. And where they are not, put measures in place to enforce them. Once we begin to do that, we begin to restore trust and with it faith in politics. And that, at this moment, is much needed. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Sir John, and a fantastic sweep across the different aspects of the standards landscape that didn't exist before the Nolan Committee, the Committee on Standards of Public Life, was set up, and so much work done, so much work, I think, still to do. I'm going to put some questions now to Sir John. Please, everyone in the audience, have your questions ready. If you're joining us online, you can submit your questions via Slido. We've already had some coming in, and so I'll be putting those as well. I wanted to start by asking you to cast your mind back to when you did first set up the committee, maybe, as you referred to, not the happiest moment, but why did you choose a model of an independent committee as the mechanism for improving standards in government? And do you think when you set it up, you expected it to have the longevity that it has had?
If your house, if you've just been burgled, you don't ask a burglar to trace who did it. If there's things going wrong in the House of Commons, the public are much more reassured if there is an independent voice examining it, rather than it be examined within the House of Commons. And for that reason, it never occurred to me that we should give it to a select committee or have it done internally. And plainly, to have a judge chairing it was the way of giving the most highest possible degree of reassurance to the public. That is what lay behind it. And as it happened, the selection of Lord Nolan turned out to be particularly, it wasn't my choice. I was given names and stuck a pen and picked one. But it was absolutely the right person for the right job at the right time. But it never occurred to me that we should do it internally. Plainly, reassurance was needed, and that reassurance had to be external. And I've forgotten the second question.
Did you think it would still be here now? Do you see it as a sort of temporary?
No, I didn't see
it
it as a temporary bandage. I did see it as something that was necessary, and that needed to happen. The belief that it is only in the last 20 or 30 years that some people have bypassed the rules is a golden memory, but it's fatuous. That is not the case. It's happened before. And the Good Chap Convention worked very well for the vast majority of people. But times change. And it was beginning to fray at the edges. And it has frayed at the edges even more. It's still good when we can do it. As much as possible, let us do by agreement. But where you find the agreement isn't working, you have to add a little muscle to the suggestion of what good behaviour, good conduct really is. And that is where I think we are now.
Are you surprised that governments more recently don't make more use of the Committee on Standards in Public Life? Because it seemed very much in its early days that there were these big ethical questions which, as you've set out, it's very useful to have a body like CSBL to look at those. But that practice seems to be less frequent in recent years.
It's 24 years since I left the House of Commons. So I don't know what may have activated the many prime ministers we have had over that brief period. I'm not sure what may have activated them not to use the committee perhaps as much as before. But it may be that some of the things that need inquiries are actually beyond the natural scope of the committee. I don't want it to be a catch-all for everything. It is a very important body to safeguard propriety in public life. That is very precious, and I wouldn't really wish to dilute it. You could, of course, stretch it and say standards in public life, or does that include standards in the House of Lords and the Commons about how well legislation is actually looked at? There are real problems with that. I mean, our legislation, when it goes through Parliament, does not receive the full scrutiny that it deserves. We over-legislate, and we have been doing for a very long time. And when you over-legislate, a part of the legislation is inadequately considered. And then, of course, at the moment, there's the outrageous situation we've had over recent years with the growing use of Henry VIII clauses. I mean, it is scandalous and it ought to stop. The House of Lords is a very eminent body, but it's sometimes a little tamer than I would wish it to be. I'd like it to stamp its foot and say, we're not having this anymore, and throw out all those clauses. But there's areas like that which I think we should look at. Why are we not having, it would be better if we had scrutiny of legislation before it is presented before the House of Commons. I think you'd get much better legislation. There would be a delay. The minister wouldn't be able to appear on television one day and say, this is a scandal, we will legislate, and start doing it next week. I recall the Dangerous Dogs Act. I throw into the conversation as a thought. It would mean there would be a delay, but we would get better legislation. And then would it not be better if 3-5 years after the legislation has been in power, it had post-legislative scrutiny? And these are ideal things for the House of Lords to do. They have a tremendous job revising legislation, but if the legislation was proper in the first place and better suited in the first place, no doubt the volume of that work would fall. There would be fewer amendments to bills. There are literally hundreds of amendments to some bills, which does make you wonder who on earth produced this nonsense in the first place. They plainly hadn't thought of it properly. And that is because everything is at such a rush these days. We are a society that demands everything today. No question of waiting. You don't have to save up for things. We'll have it today and we'll borrow the money. It's a general society change. But in terms of good legislation, not to examine it properly before you legislate is to fail to do what Parliament is set up to do.
I completely agree on that, and the Institute's done work on that. And I think this government has promised some pre-legislative scrutiny, but it hasn't yet appeared. The House of Lords does, I think, normally one of its ad hoc committees each year is a post-legislative scrutiny committee, but that sort of just demonstrates how valuable that work can be. And I think the point you make about legislation points back to the point you were making about standards, the difficulty that if things are done and not challenged, they become the norm, and then it's that much harder to unpick and to restore what might have been there before.
Would it not be a useful idea to have a committee of experienced politicians whose job is not to make public pronouncements, but to actually look at what this country needs to achieve to make sure it is at least as relevant in the world in 25 years' time as it is now, to point out the trends that are just beginning that we need to correct before we have a crisis. Perhaps if we'd done that 20 years ago, we wouldn't be short of the carpenters, the builders, the glaziers that we need to reach 1.5 million houses over a parliament, which we badly need. It's absolutely the right thing to seek to achieve, but have we got the capacity to achieve it? And plainly, with the advent of AI, there's going to have to be committees looking at the long-term use of what it may be for and how to use it and safeguard against misuse. How many of us saw the misuse? I didn't. How many of us saw the misuse of the social media? It has been a very mixed blessing indeed. And I don't think we realized that. We welcomed what it could be used for that was good. Maybe politicians' minds are too innocent and naive, but they didn't see, and I didn't see, so I'm not criticizing them, the manner in which social media could be used for downright wickedness, quite apart from good reasons.
Absolutely. I'm going to take some of the questions that have come through online, and people online are upvoting the ones they like the best. So I'm going to take the top question at the moment, which is from Louis Rimmer, who's touching on the points you were making about appointments to the House of Lords. Mm-hmm. He says, is there a role for something akin to a citizens' assembly or jury for selecting or reviewing appointments to the Lords to ensure that they pass the smell test and really add value to the House? Is there some way of involving the public more in that decision?
Well, there is a problem there. I see the point, absolutely. And it would it would be a good idea to make sure that on the committee that examines this, there should people who actually represent the public rather than Parliament. There should certainly be outside people on that particular committee. But having yet another committee to to double check what is being done. I tread on very dangerous ground with the analogy I'm just going to draw. But the selection of party leaders seemed to me to have been less in the public interest when a large part of it is made by people who do not personally know the candidates. And I think knowing the candidates and understanding what they've got to do is a very valuable part of making sure the right people are appointed. So I think Louis has a good point about having people who are quite separate from Parliament actually sitting on the original scrutiny committee, but I'm not sure I'd set up a second one, if I understand his question.
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely the question. Another question from Sam Power. In the new ministerial code, which Keir Starmer's published, as all new prime ministers do, he describes restoring trust in politics as the greatest test of our era. What grade would you give the Labour Party 1 year in?
Truly, it's an amusing and tempting question, but it's really too soon to say. I have great sympathy that they haven't introduced their ethics legislation. I suspect, I may be wholly wrong, that they haven't fully thought out what it's going to be. But more to the point, there have been a whole series of raging priorities that needed to be dealt with. And I think this is an important priority, but I can see why it is in the queue. So I'm not too critical that they have delayed. And as I said, I don't see any need to reinvent the wheel, but then I don't know what they have in mind. And I'm sure when they know, they'll tell us.
Maybe we'll find out later today.
Well, who knows? We may. All things are possible.
I was very struck, though, and I totally agree with you about priorities. I was struck by the point, though, that you were making, which is absolutely right, it seems to me, about the relevance of standards to growth, about the value to this country of being seen to have high ethical standards, systems, legal systems, and so on, that work and that can be relied upon. Do you feel as though sometimes politicians don't do enough, if there isn't an immediate crisis, they don't do enough to sort of mend the roof, when the sun is shining, as it is today, that although there are many other priorities, this should actually really be a priority, and there could be, it's difficult for politicians to maintain that sense of priority, but it should nonetheless be there.
Well, of course, it's a very, very important priority. And it shouldn't be left to wither on the vine. That is absolutely true. But I think there are some things that governments just have to do straight away. And I can recall occasions, though I can't recall what actual bills were, when something worthy had to wait in the wings rather longer than it should have done. So I have some sympathy for that. It's very easy, people on the outside, to criticise governments for their slowness in doing things. It would be a great advantage for the greatest critics to actually spend a month or two in government and discover the reality of life rather than the external perception of what they think life should be like.
I'm going to take you back to the points you made about appointments to the House of Lords and about the qualities of the people and who are appointed and their willingness to do the very important work of the House of Lords. I think the other angle on this, isn't it right, that the very size of the House of Lords is affecting trust in the House, and it affects not only what people think of it, but also its functioning, because with that many people, what can be achieved is diluted in some ways. People have to roll on on and off committees more quickly in order to give everyone a go, which means that they don't build up as much expertise, in my view. Is there anything else you think needs to be done? Obviously, the government has the hereditary peers bill going through, but in terms of thinking about the size of the House of Lords?
Well, I think other than the Communist Party's general programme, I think it is pretty much the largest house you'll find anywhere. It is plainly too big. That said, there are an awful lot of people who are non-attenders. So it does look ludicrous that it is so big. But in practice, it's a slightly lesser problem than it might be. But what shows the size is the limit in time for speeches. Now, that argues various things. It argues there are too many amendments going through the House of Lords, too much going through the House of Lords. They've only got a limited time to do things, and therefore there's only a limited time for every individual to speak. But I know some of the great national addresses of all time, the Ten Commandments perhaps being a supreme example, can be produced in very few words. But the complexity of politics and public life is such that it is extremely difficult to get a proper explanation that is clear to everybody listening and to the public at large of many complex issues in the handful of minutes they're allowed to speak in the House of Lords. It's too short. What William Pitt, who would probably the first Pitt who was in the House of Lords, would have thought of making a speech inside 3 hours, I don't know. But we look back on that as some of the most remarkable speeches ever made. And so it is a shame that you see them squeezed. People with huge talent, most of them, be put there because they have great knowledge of something. I mean, I am flatly opposed, always have been flatly opposed to an elected House of Lords because it doesn't reflect what the House of Lords does. And the moment you had an elected House, you can be absolutely sure of one thing: it will start challenging the Commons for supremacy, and you're going to have a great constitutional crisis. But the work of the House of Lords requires a different skill set from the work of the House of Commons, which is why it has worked so well being appointed rather than elected. But there are some changes that can be made in the system of appointment, I think.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that any reform to the House of Lords needs to start from what we want it to do before we make decisions.
And which is why it would be a good time to look at what the House of Lords could do better than the Commons, because it is a more reflective assembly than the Commons.
One more question from me, and then I'm going to come to questions in the room. You briefly referenced the second Trump presidency. I wonder what impact you think the flagrant corruption of that administration is having on us in the UK. What lessons are our political classes taking from the Trump administration, and what lessons should they take?
I think they should regard it as a cautionary tale. I don't think I'm going to add to that at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to take questions in the room. My colleague Lauren has a microphone. If you wouldn't mind telling us who you are and where you're from, so we know where your question is coming from. And we'll take questions. Should we take them one at a time, or do you want to take them in groups?
One of the advantages of taking them in groups is you can dodge the ones you don't know the answer to. Okay. It's why Prime Minister's questions always fails. Because somebody stands up and they've got their 3 minutes asking a question, they ask several, and the Prime Minister can pick the one he knows the answer to.
Okay.
They should have watched Tam Dalyell in action, who was a brilliant questioner. He would stand up and say, why? Now that is a deadly question. And I saw him leave more ministers open-mouthed than I can recall.
We'll take them in groups then, shall we?
I'm relaxed.
Thank you very much. I'm Jane Ramsey, and for the purposes of where I'm coming from, I was a member of the Committee on Standards in Public Life from 2016 to 2020, and about 18 months ago I was put into the House of Lords on the Labour benches. Sir John, I enjoyed every word of your speech, so powerful. I particularly enjoyed and was worried what you were about to say about the quality of people who are more recently being put into the House, but I felt that you probably weren't directly looking at me. I'm also the chair of the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee in the Lords, which scrutinises all bills, and we report to the House and sometimes on things like Henry VIII clauses. We've had a real push. Both, I have to say, my predecessor chair, looking to continuity, Hannah, Lord Patrick McLaughlin, who you'll know well, and me in taking over, into looking at things like Henry VIII clauses and improving for this new government, perhaps on previous governments, acceptance of recommendations of that committee. One of the things that's emerged in some further work that we've done is that ministers of many administrations in recent years, many governments, and civil servants aren't taught anything about the Constitution, and actually quite a lot of them don't know about Henry VIII clauses. So I wondered if you had any thoughts or advice on that. And I'd also do a plug for anyone who's interested in such things to look at the Democracy Denied report by the committee several years ago before I was chair, which is really excellent on all of the points that you've made about parliamentary scrutiny in the Lords.
Thank you very much. Other questions behind you?
Yeah, Peter Riddle. 2 points I might. One, endorsing your point on statutory backing for CSPL. I did a review for the Cabinet Office of CSPL about 13 years ago, and there was then quite substantial calls for it to be abolished or put on a care and maintenance basis, both of which have been disastrous. Hannah was the secretary at the time and knows some of the problems. So I think it's really important to prevent any uncertainty. I think that also applies to the other regulators. The question I wanted to ask was, how does the Prime Minister fit into the model of either being investigated or held to account? And we've got two independent, one former and the current independent advisor in the room. But you could argue the political process does it, as happened 3 years ago, almost exactly, to remove a party's revolt. But how do you both investigate and hold to account a Prime Minister who don't want to say it goes rogue?
Okay, and one more, just, yeah, no, in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Marianne Overton, Chair of the Civility Steering Group on the Local Government Association. And we've been very pleased to contribute to your excellent work, and thank you very much for your superb speech. The question I want to come on to is how much you think many of the principles that you've been talking about, and of course we do adopt the Nolan Principles, and our councils have largely adopted the new code of conduct that the LGA have produced, that our group has worked on and produced. But how much connection or synergy can you see between what's happening in Parliament and local government? Thank you.
Right.
Right. So, advice on ministers, how we can help ministers understand the Constitution better, the role of the Prime Minister in advising, if you want, how it works if you're investigating a Prime Minister, if the advisor is investigating a Prime Minister who's gone rogue, in Peter's words, and that comparison between what's going on in Westminster and local government.
The first point about the Constitution, isn't it sad that you have to ask that question? That you have people becoming ministers, elected to the House of Commons, who have learned on their route to the House of Commons, which used to be a lengthy route, is sometimes much foreshortened these days, that they haven't actually understood the principles of the Constitution. And I find it quite extraordinary, but I know it to be true, particularly with some new members of Parliament I've talked to whose understanding of constitutional principles is very shaky. Quite how to correct it, I don't know. I do know successive speakers, certainly this speaker, has seen backbench members in groups and talked to them about the Constitution. But that, of course, is one man's initiative. It's quite difficult to corral them as though they were children at school and sit them down and explain the Constitution to them. I think the person doing that might not find it an altogether happy occasion. So it's a tricky question. It is necessary, but I don't see an easy answer other than the fact that if they have ears to hear and eyes to see, they ought to learn a great deal about the Constitution by the working of the House of Lords or the House of Commons within their first few months. If they fail to do so, I wonder whether they are suited for the task. But I don't see a simple answer to that. I think we could find some of our great constitutionalists, there are several of them about, very eminent, who might be persuaded to come along and deliver a lecture to new members of the House of Commons or Lords. That might be very helpful. But of course you couldn't compel attendance. Though the whips could mention gently, in the fashion that they do, that it would be a good idea for them to attend. I suppose something like that could be tried. How effective it would be, I'm not sure. It may be a problem. Not every problem has a solution that is obvious, and I'm not sure that this one does, but it is a real problem, and I understand that. Peter's question, I'm pleased he agrees with what I had to say about statutory bodies. How to hold the Prime Minister to account? Well, if the Prime Minister is acting in an absolutely egregious way, the time will come when the House of Commons will rise up and strike him down. But given the extent to which Prime Ministers used to be regarded as first among equals, these days, the amount of decision that has to go up to the Prime Minister is outrageously high. And so you're passing something up to someone who has less background than ministers at a lower level, simply because that is the way the system works. Works in the banks too. Try and phone the banks for anything, and before you get to the chairman or the chief executive, you won't get an answer. At least I can't. And so there is a tendency for decisions to waft upwards. The sort of thing I had in mind, if Laurie Magnus is here, it'll be his. He will no doubt take note. The sort of thing I had in mind that he might investigate if the Prime Minister had done something reasonably serious in what he notified the Commons he had done in some ways, or had failed to notify him. I think there are areas like that. But when it is regional constitutional issues, it is for the Commons, of course. But the Commons doesn't always rise up in the way that it should. And I will give you a practical example that stung me to the core at the time and still does. In the Brexit debates, 21 Conservative MPs who stuck to the party's previous policy for 40 years that they believed we should remain within the European Union had the whip withdrawn and their political careers ended by edict of the Prime Minister. And I simply asked myself this question: where was the chairman of the 1922 committee? Where was the chief whip? Where was the body of the 1922 committee to say, up with this, we will not put? So you can't always regard the House of Commons in the way in which there's an overmighty belief, at least initially, in the power of any Prime Minister and an obedience to what he or she has to say. So I think there are areas that would be suitable for Laurie to examine. He hopes there won't be, I know, as far as the Prime Minister is concerned. But if there are, and there are other areas which are legitimately for the Commons. And I hope the Commons will not be fearful of doing that when they see misuse at a very high level. Because misuse at a very high level will undoubtedly attract support from some quarters, because there are always people who are keen to make sure that they are on the same side of the argument as the person with the greatest single amount of power. You might have seen that in the fact that President Biden didn't decide he would stand down because he was constantly being told by people surrounding him that only he could defeat Donald Trump. And that has proved to be a damaging decision. And I picked one outside the United Kingdom, but I could have picked one or two inside it. Oh, and there was a third question, wasn't there?
Parliament and local government.
Yes, I'm so out of date. I mean, I spent some time in local government in the 1960s. I was the housing chairman of Lambeth for 3 years, under the guidance of a most wonderful local government officer called Harry Simpson, who lives with me still, one of the greatest public servants I ever worked with. And he taught me a great deal about housing and how to deal with it. And I was succeeded as chairman of the Housing Committee in 1971 by a guy called Ken Livingstone, who also learned a great deal from Harry, but didn't implement it. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure to what extent I don't know is the true answer, to what extent local government may face the same temptations and some of the same difficulties that Parliament have faced. I know what has happened in Parliament pretty much. I'm afraid I don't with local government. But I'm assuming that most people behave themselves because I haven't heard to the contrary.
I felt many of your comments were very pertinent. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we'll take another round of this three gentlemen here.
Thank you. Duncan Hames, Transparency International UK. So John, you had a stark warning for us about the growing dependency of political parties on the donations of a very small number of ultra-wealthy individuals. Now that Australia has joined Canada in having annual limits on campaign donations, and given the picture you painted very well for us of what has happened in the United States. Do you think it could now be a situation here of that it's a matter of finding a level that would be tolerable for financing our political parties rather than whether or not we need this safeguard to protect our democratic process?
Well, it's a tricky question because it is in our interest to have a properly functioning series of political parties. Bankrupt political parties with no members are not going to be as good in choosing candidates, apart from anything else, aren't going to be as good for the country's political system as flourishing parties with large membership, well-funded. Parties that are bankrupt, spending all their time not thinking about policy, not putting pressure on their MP, not passing on to their MP what they should do. MPs not having branch meetings all the time and being subjected to the views of people in his constituency. All those things are lost if you don't have a properly functioning system at the grassroots. And money matters to make sure that politics, money in many ways is the root of all progress. And if they're not properly funded, there is a loss to the political system. But the public will bitterly resent, I should say, rather than they might resent and regret, will bitterly resent any more public money going into funding the political parties. So there is a balance to be kept. And when that balance is met by a small number of people making much greater donations, now there will be two different sorts of people doing that. There'll be those who are genuinely concerned about the Constitution and who will give great sums of money asking nothing. I can think of many people who have done that, and you couldn't exclude them in the present system of appointing to the House of Lords. They mustn't be excluded because they donated to political parties. If they deserve the preferment for other reasons set out, you can't exclude them just because they do that. But the political parties must be funded. If they're not funded, there are difficulties, but they're not going to be funded at the moment without these large donations from individuals. And what I was trying to do was just warn today that this is a rising problem, particularly with the collapse in membership of so many of the political parties. And they need to be looking at the widest possible source of funding, because Parliament will not wish to hand out more public money to them. And they must not become too reliant on a handful of people. So it was really a warning. If they do, and nothing changes, then I think we will come to a circumstance where Parliament will have to legislate to limit, in order to protect the public from being suspicious of what is happening, to protect the limit that individuals can donate during the course of the Parliament. I was warning that that could come in the future. And I was warning now because there is a chance to avoid it if we can. But it won't be easy. I think there's a real problem there. Sorry, that was very rambling because I was trying to think how best to describe it.
Yeah.
Hi, Patrick Thomas, Constitution Specialist for the House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Indeed, I think my colleague and I are probably responsible, or at least help the committee draft a number of those recommendations that are sitting on shelves in government at the moment. And if you forgive a quick plug, we actually have an inquiry into propriety and ethics, the committee has at the moment, and also into ministerial statements and the ministerial code. So if anybody is interested in writing in on that.
When you're inquiring into ministerial statements, that is ambiguous. You mean you are inquiring into the accuracy
we are inquiring
of ministerial statements?
The Speaker wrote to the committee to asked us to inquire into the government making statements elsewhere other than to the House of Commons first.
Yes,
and that is not in line with the Ministerial Code 9.1, which says that they should be made first to the House of Commons. So we're looking at that.
But there's no sanction. What's to stop them?
Well,
other than them being self-regulated and being shouted at occasionally by the Speaker.
So that gets to my question. You mentioned that you think sanctions may now be necessary to uphold standards in public life. What type and level of sanctions do you think would be effective in doing so and restoring public trust?
Well, that's easy. I'd set up a committee like yours to advise me. I mean, just taking a figure off the top of my head would be pointless. But I think there has to be a way to deter the governments collectively. It's not just this government. I'm not making a party point, and to deter governments from doing this. It demeans the House of Commons, and we shouldn't do that. We really shouldn't do that. Half the world has followed our political system, and for it to begin to get ragged at the edges is actually damaging to the image of this country. You may say that's a very pompous thing to say, but it's true, and we don't want that. So the government needs to be told very forcibly, not gently, very forcibly, that it isn't the sort of thing that will happen. Now, I suppose the Speaker could try and deny them making the statement. Well, they've made the statement outside, so he can't really deny them making it inside, because Parliament will also wish to know it. It's just really malpractice. But I don't know. We'd have to consider what the options are. Have you got a table of options?
Not yet. We've only just launched the inquiry. So.
Do you want to pass the mic forward?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks to John for his address today. I was actually going to ask on the same subject, because I think this issue of ministerial statements being made outside the House has become an increasing problem. And if you look at the recent budget as an example, we've got to the situation that much of the budget is now in the public domain before it gets to the House. Now, there was one situation, John, quite recently, where the Speaker forbid the government from making a statement on the basis that they had already made a statement outside the House. It's a worrying trend, and I'd actually go further than you would do, because I think this actually undermines our democracy. And I think there's a wider point to all of that, just thinking through what you were saying and going back to the Brexit period and the Tory MPs that lost the whip, because there was something else that happened at that time that took us into uncharted territory, and that was that the House of Commons was able to take control of the order paper with the support of a Speaker at that time. But I wonder what you would do to make our politics more accountable and more democratic. If I think about what happens in the devolved administrations, the corporate body, the Scottish Parliament, for example, has much more influence on the timetabling. And we've got the situation, if you think about opposition days, that they're really not effective, but we need to find a way that Parliament can hold the executive to account. And I think your point about scrutiny of bills, and I absolutely accept about what you say about the role of the House of Lords and all of that. But the reforms to the House of Commons have constrained our ability to hold the legislature to account, to have effective scrutiny. And I think we have to come back and look at that. And I wonder, so the one bit I'm going to get to in terms of making that work and making votes pertinent as to whether or not we have to look at the way that we vote in the House of Commons and bring in electronic voting, which would then allow the Speaker to be more expansive in allowing that proper scrutiny of amendments to take place in the House of Commons.
Well, I think there are a whole series of areas. Most of us in Parliament are believers to a greater or lesser extent in tradition. Because tradition is going up for a purpose and we know it works. But in a changing world like ours, there have to be changes in the way the House of Commons operates as well. And I do think, I'm not going to throw out a series of individual half-thought-out suggestions, but I do think it will be worth having an inquiry into areas where the House of Commons may not be making the best use of its time and may not be democratically providing enough opportunity for the minority parties to have some input into what is happening. But I think that is an inquiry Parliament must hold. And I think the time is coming where it should do so. I mean, we were a two-party system. When I first got involved in politics in the late 1950s, the Conservative and Labour parties got over 90% of the vote at general elections. It was 54%, 54, 55, 56% at the last election. And we are no longer a two-party system in the way we once were. And that's going to have its ramifications in Parliament as well. Now, it may change. Who knows? At the next election, the Labour government and the Tory opposition may get 93% of the vote again. But I wouldn't put my house on it. So I do think the time is coming when we have to have a root, rather than looking at individual little tiddly bits here and there, a root and branch look at how our politics works and how the House of Commons makes the best use of its time in the interest of the nation, which is what it is there for.
Couldn't agree more. We're going to take a question just there.
Thanks, Sir John. Carolyn Quinn. You mentioned AI and social media in your speech, and I wonder how difficult you feel that makes the current holder of your post. What challenges are there for the fact that the public can make their views known very, very quickly? There are campaigns that can activate incredibly quickly. I mean, in your day, you had your challenges on the backbenches and on your own cabinet, but nevertheless, you know, a petition would take some time to get through to you. Can you just talk about the challenges that you think that poses the current holder of the post, and what it does for trust in politicians when people can get their information from so many different sources now?
It is a nightmare. Thank God I left politics before social media became a really a big problem, because the truth is politics is complex. When you actually seek to make decisions that are right, there are many areas you have to take into account dealing with the problem, and then the knock-on effect. For every action, there is a reaction. What is the reaction to what you actually decide to do? Who does it affect adversely as well as favourably? And to do that properly, you need to consider it. You need to have some thinking time. The Prime Minister in particular and senior members of his cabinet have very little thinking time because the pressure is appalling. I would remember being out and about in the country, and I'd suddenly find some reporters in front of me throwing me questions about something I didn't know had happened. And if that was a problem for me then, it is a problem multiplied 100 times over for senior politicians today. And it's very difficult to say when you're faced by a dozen cameras that, I'm sorry, I need to consider that. The first time they'll think, oh, that's nice and open-minded. The second time they'll simply say, he doesn't know what he's doing. And in the meantime, there'll be all sorts of people appearing on television who know exactly what they're doing, except that they haven't thought through the consequences of what you could do and what the implications of that are. And I'm afraid this is a world that leads to poorly considered and damaging legislation. And ideally, politics is at its best when it does not appear on the front pages of the newspapers. It ought to be inside. People ought to be much more interested in other things than the squabbles and dramas that are played up so much, often way beyond anything they're worth in the media, because it is newsworthy. And I don't know of a solution to that. Carolyn, actually, you're as likely to know a solution as I am. And one of the points I perhaps ought to impress, because I can actually say it to you now, Prime Ministers don't have an answer to every question. And half the questions they wish they were never asked, because there isn't an answer. So I think it'd be better if this was understood. I think it would help if sometimes, maybe on the Sunday morning programmes, someone sometimes said to the interviewer, well, that question throws up the following problems, and then lists the 5 or 6 things that the questioner probably hasn't thought about, but that somebody inside politics who actually deals with the detail of what legislation means will have thought about. But it isn't the style of interviewing. These days, one of the things I think that has really damaged the public's understanding of politics is the lack of the long interview. There is no Robin Day. There is no Brian Walden. Nobody is given an hour to sit the Prime Minister down or a senior member of government or opposition and probe deeply into not only what they're going to do with the slogan of this. It really started appallingly, I'm sorry to say, because it is a party point, when members of Parliament began getting messages each day from the Whip's office as to what the line of the day was. And you found half a dozen different MPs saying exactly the same thing. Very boring. And also extremely damaging to original thought. So I'm just whinging about the things that don't happen because there is no answer. You can't disinvent social media. We might be able to control it a bit better. I must say I hope government will find a way in which the servers cannot publish something that does not have a legitimate name attached to it. the anonymous abuse that is going towards people in public life, particularly women actually, is totally unacceptable by some cretin hiding behind anonymity, but with the use of the web. I hope we are seriously thinking, because with the advent of AI, who knows how that will develop. But again, you probe an area where no one is going to give you a glib answer. Well, everyone will give you a glib answer, but it's a glib answer that is meaningless until we actually take action to solve the core of the problem. And the core of the problem is social media.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw this session to a close. Thank you so much, Sir John, for such an interesting hour of your time, really getting into the complexity of some of these issues. Can I ask everyone to join me in thanking Sir John? We are now going to have a 15-minute break. For those of you who are here in the room, there are refreshments on the landing, and then we will have our next panel, which is on how politicians can demonstrate ethical leadership. So do join us for that. Thank you.
Neil, let us know when we're good to go. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to those online. My name is Tim Durrant. I am a Programme Director here at the IFG. I'm delighted to be hosting our first panel of our conference, talking about the role of politicians as leaders and how they demonstrate ethical leadership in public life. With trust in politics and politicians consistently low, we wanted to look into the role that politicians play. How should politicians in Westminster, the devolved governments and local governments demonstrate their commitment to the Nolan Principles? How can they show ethical leadership within their organisations? And what does upholding standards actually look like day to day in these different political and governmental contexts? We've got a fantastic panel to talk about all of this. So starting over here, Dave Penman, General Secretary of the FDA, the Union for Senior Civil Servants, Paula Barker MP, Labour MP for Liverpool Wavertree and Deputy Chair of the Committee on Standards in the Commons, Dr Melissa McCulloch, Commissioner for Standards in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and Roger Goff, who until the elections in May was the leader of Kent County Council. So lots of interesting different perspectives here. As ever, we're going to kick off with some discussion at the panel. We'll have plenty of time for questions, including from people online. If you are online, please do start sending in your questions via Slido. We will take as many of those as possible. Without further ado, I wanted to turn to Paula first. What do you see as the role of MPs, ministers and other elected politicians in setting the tone for ethics and standards in public life in its widest sense?
Well, I think first and foremost, it is to lead by example. We have obviously the 7 Nolan Principles, and I think that everybody in public life should act in accordance with them. I think if they do, they won't go far wrong, I think we can all safely say. But I think that's how you actually set the tone within politics and, of course, build trust. And we all know that, sadly, trust in politics is at an all-time low. And I think we've moved from a period of apathy to outright fury at times with politicians. I think there's lots of different factors that contribute to that. Obviously, when we have economic turbulence, that adds to it. When people are feeling that the economy is not working for them and they see politicians acting in what they believe is a hypocritical way, that really, really makes them angry, and rightly so, because they look at it and they say, well, it's one rule for them and it's another rule for us. And if we look back at the COVID period, you know, I got really cross about sort of the talk around the VIP fast lane and contracts. But when you looked at what the public was really angry about, they were angry about parties and rule breaking. Because they saw that it was double standards. So I think that we do all have to uphold the Nolan Principles, and I think hopefully that will go some way to restoring trust and confidence.
Well, thank you. Roger, if I can turn to you next.
Sure.
You were a local government leader for a long time. What does ethical leadership look like at that level? Do you agree with what Paula just said? And do you recognise her description of outright fury among the public?
Absolutely. I think it's a slightly complicated relationship with local government. So as I say, I was for 20 years county councillor in Kent. For the last 5.5, I was leader of the county council. Of all of which responsibilities and burdens I was liberated by the electorate in May, which at least gives some more time to reflect. I think, firstly, the issues around issues like partygate that Paula mentioned, I think have a knock-on effect onto local government. I think the things that actually land the most heavily in terms of generating that frustration and so on, which the results of which we saw at the elections, are actually more to do with delivery than they are to do, by and large, with probity and scandals and the like at the local government level. If you look back to what the Committee on Standards of Public Life said in its review, I think it was 2019, I think the view there was that actually, in most cases, the standards were almost all or the overwhelming majority of councillors did operate by those standards, that you do clearly have levels of probity which are reasonably well enforced. But there were perhaps emerging issues to do with standards of conduct, bullying, harassment, use of social media, and so on. Again, by a certain minority, but that was more the emerging issue. So I think there are two slightly separate issues in terms of how you try and measure all this in local government. One is, on the one side, what is it that is affecting the public? And I think for the most part, that is actually to do with local government's part in the perception that nothing works. And that was what played into us at the elections. I think some of the challenges in terms of behaviour are things which are more an impact within councils, and that has generated some particular issues over the last few years, which certainly I had to manage as part of my time as leader. An interesting thought which occurred to me was that whether, in the announcement we had a couple of days ago about the grooming gangs inquiry and so on, whether that will raise questions about, because obviously local authorities will be a big part of that, whether there is perhaps a bigger question about what conduct there has been, at least in parts of local government. So whether that's an emerging issue, whether there are other areas to which that should be applied. But many of the traditional probity issues I don't think have been so much in the frame of late. And otherwise, as I say, I think the other really interesting question which local government is going to have to address, the new government brought in a consultation in December on the standards regime of local government, looking at some of the deficiencies, arguably, of what was brought in 2011. I think there is some considerable validity in that. And what I think will be interesting is, given the changes we've seen in councils, whether that will accelerate the move towards, and it goes back to the point Sir John Major made, moving on from a world of relative informality and relying on good chaps to actually something that needs to be more prescriptive. And I can think of a couple of reasons why that might be the case. I'll leave it there for the moment, but there's a lot else we can go back over.
Absolutely, lots to pick up in there. Melissa, actually, that's a good segue, though, because your role in the Northern Ireland Assembly is defined in legislation in Holyrood. So it is more on that sort of formal end of the spectrum there. In the Assembly. Like, from your experience in Northern Ireland, how do politicians think about ethical standards in their work? And does having that sort of more formal basis strengthen your position? Does it help with kind of bolstering the standard system in that setting?
I think so. I think it does inevitably. I mean, lots of powers come with the role, compelling, a lot of things come with the role that make it impossible for members, although they might try to dodge and disengage, eventually they have to engage, and that can be through a variety of legislative measures that are incorporated. And sadly, at one point, I did have to actually look into that legislation. You shouldn't have to, as a commissioner, actually go to the level of someone not engaging. But anyway, it doesn't normally happen. It does not normally happen, and I think that's why. I suppose the other interesting thing about Northern Ireland, there's a lot of very interesting things. I've lived there for 30 years. I love the place. And we have great, great politicians. And I think the best of them, I can see them living the principles. Like Sir John was saying, they're living the principles. They're using it as their moral compass. The odd person might even email and say, some dilemma they're having. It doesn't happen all the time, but there's an open door policy, and I think it's really important in the context of Northern Ireland as well, which is difficult history, that the standards actually, that we look at them and we take them very, very seriously. I actually do take them very seriously, and when I first got into the position, about a year in, there was a private member's bill passed where the commissioner would consider all complaints against ministers as well, which is a bit shocking, but I've now considered about 250 complaints against ministers. I think there's nothing to be afraid of there. I think if you have, good legislation and you're following a good process, solid, which we do have there, I think it actually makes it a more solid standards situation over there. And, I'm a big believer in, why wouldn't, they asked me my view on it when I first went in, and as an academic in ethics, I said, well, why wouldn't the commissioner look at that? Naively, but I still believe that. Why wouldn't it? And it's worked out just fine. So I think there is something about having those different levels of legislation in for the commissioner has made my job, I think, quite effective in dealing with complaints by members and members who are ministers.
Great, thank you very much. And again, lots more to pick up on there. But Dave, just to bring you in, we've talked about politicians. Your union represents civil servants. What's the kind of behaviour that your members look for from the politicians they work with?
I mean, the first thing I think to say is that, everyone hears when it goes wrong, but actually most of the time it works really well between ministers and civil servants. I think civil servants look for respect from ministers. They're all working hard. They understand the difficult job that ministers have got. How fleeting that can be, and that most ministers are in trying to do the right thing, and I think they understand the complexities and difficult world that they've got, and what they want to do is to advise and make things work. That's why they do the job they do. I think that respect's not always there. I think in the last government in particular, a very senior civil servant said to me, a lot of the ministers think that, we're only here as civil servants because we can't get a job in the private sector, basically. And there was a kind of lack of respect for the civil service, and you saw some of that with those behaviours. So I think that bit of respect for the professionalism and what the role of a civil servant is to do about advising is part of what they want to see from ministers. Ministers have an obligation under the Ministerial Code to listen to evidence-based advice, but they get to make decisions around it. But listening to that advice and treating those giving the advice with the respect they deserve for that. And then also, I think civil servants want to know that ministers are acting with integrity. And what I mean by that is in the kind of public interest. That's really what they're about. They're not naive. They know that there's politics at play. They know there's ambition at play. And that ministers, if you're a junior minister, you want to become a Secretary of State. If you want a Secretary of State, you may want to become Prime Minister. There's lots of stuff goes on of why people want to push legislation and do stuff. So there are elements of that, but generally in the main, that you're looking and seeing that what a minister's trying to do is in the public good. And I'll give an example I think that kind of demonstrates that. I remember talking to a senior civil servant about a minister who did not have a good reputation, and it wasn't about standards. It was just a kind of competence kind of reputation, and particularly in the kind of public realm. And I was just talking to him, saying, "What's it like working for that minister?" And he says it's great to work for because he said he will always listen to advice, and he's always very respectful. He says he completely ignores it, right? And goes off and does the opposite, and it's completely the wrong thing to do. And history has, since someone in the minister has shown that it was, right, over a series of things. But at no point was there any question about that and the nature of that decision, that minister wasn't trying to do the right thing, maybe made the wrong choices, and we can all kind of second guess that. But there was no doubt that was a minister who was in government for the right reasons, was respectful of the civil servant, and was trying to do good in the public interest. And I think that's what really civil servants want. It's not that ministers have to agree with them or follow the advice. It's just that actually they kind of all in it together and try to do the right thing.
I think that's really interesting. And as you say, obviously that's the minister's prerogative to make those decisions. I think there's something here about is this kind of behaviour or this interest in standards, is this something that is inherent, or is it something that is learned, or is it something, if we want to be kind of more instrumental about it, is it something that is good for you because it gets you up the career ladder? What do people think? Do people think that people in public life sort of stick to high standards of behaviour because it's the right thing to do, or is it more transactional than that? Because most people in public life, I think, do stick to high standards.
I mean, I would say my experience of ministers and talk to civil servants is that, I mean, you talked about the kind of trust in politicians and you get that kind of veracity index about, and it's low. But actually, the vast majority of both politicians and those who end up making it in government are trying to do the right thing. The vast majority of them, it's a terrible life being a politician, an elected politician, for all sorts of reasons, right? And then when you end up in government, trying to make progress in government as well, it's so tough to do that, and everything that you have to go just to even get to that point. And I think most members of the public don't get to see that, really. And I think what drives a lot of people into politics is all of the right instincts, and they want to do the right thing. Whether they do that when they get there all the time, but actually I think most of the time those kind of, what pushes them in that is the right thing.
Yeah.
No, and I was just going to say it takes a lot of discipline to have, to consider all the principles that, you want to put in practice. And with every pressure that they have, and I see every complaint that comes through, unlike other offices, I am the only person in the office, so I see every complaint, and I can tell, there's a lot of inadmissible complaints. But, there's also a lot of pressure on politicians. They don't need to be perfect, but they have to be disciplined enough to do enough. And I feel that, the vast majority are doing their very best and trying to do their very best. And that's the beauty of the standard system, is that when they fall, there's the learning that can come from it, and there's a good system, an independent system, and that's key, an independent system to investigate and look into those matters. And I think it sets the culture as well. So there's a lot of things that set the culture from the top, but also a commissioner who's serious and takes complaints very seriously. So I think there's a lot of elements, but that's one of them.
Great, thank you. Roger.
Yeah, I think, again, my observation over the years has been that, certainly in local government, the overwhelming majority, and I'm talking overwhelming, come in and act for the right reasons. What you can sometimes get, I think, is slightly more blurry side of things, which is an impatience with some rules, a sense that it's all very clunky and getting in the way, and actually there's a better way you could do this, and that can occasionally be an issue. I think there are, interestingly, some cultural challenges, more generally going back a little bit to Dave's point, but thinking about it at local level, between members and officers. And it's worth remembering in local government, there is a much more direct relationship between officers of the council and all members of the council that there is between, let's say, Whitehall and all the 650 MPs. So that can generate a whole number of tensions. In recent years, there's been quite a lot of commentary about how the level of irritation in that relationship has tended to increase. And I think that was one of the things that I sort of grappled with a little bit as leader. But the final point is I do agree with the point about trying to set the standard from the top. And I think that is really, really important that you try and shape the culture. I was struck here by a comment from the committee, again in its, I think it's review on local government. An ethical culture starts with tone. Whilst there will always be robust disagreement in a political arena, the tone of engagement should be civil and constructive. And I think that relates both to how members relate to each other, but also actually the member-officer relationship.
Yeah. Did you want to comment there?
Yeah, I mean, I concur with everything that's been said, to be honest. And I think the majority of politicians that, go into politics and into the House are deeply committed to public service. And I think, as somebody who has more than 30 years experience in the public services and local government and obviously now in the House, it's something that deeply matters to me. And I think that the majority of colleagues actually share that view. I think it was really interesting what you said, Melissa, about, we're not expected to be perfect, because actually, I think sometimes the public expect us to be perfect. And I know you're not going to believe this, but we're human and we have flaws. And occasionally we do make mistakes. But, a lot of people would want to see people tarred and feathered if we make mistakes. The system should be there to support us, for us to be able to hold our hands up and say, do you know what, we got this wrong and we're genuinely sorry. And we're going to learn from this. And I was watching Sir John's comments just in another room, and I think it was really interesting that he touched on social media, because social media has now created such a cesspit, to be quite frank, where, you can use whatever name you want on the likes of X, formerly Twitter, and you can pour yourself a glass of wine and then let loose on a Friday night and think that there should be no consequences to that. And I think that as a society, we are all the poorer for that. And I think it has massively contributed to the public perception of MPs and the hatred that is often felt towards them.
I think that's right. I think everyone here probably agrees with that. I wanted to pick up on something specific. So you mentioned, the importance of remembering that MPs are human, and that is one of our sort of overarching messages at the IFG, that MPs, ministers, and civil servants are all human, and they're all generally trying to do their best. Specific question for you, Paula. Your committee, the committee that you sit on in the Commons, oversees the Code of Conduct for MPs and the work of the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, who is here in the room as well. Thank you very much. Tell us why it's important that elected politicians are the ones who oversee the rules for other elected politicians. Well,
I think, obviously, we have... if a complaint is received, then obviously the Commissioner is the first port of call, and then he makes a decision whether or not it should actually come in front of our committee. And he's an advisor to the committee, and we value the Commissioner's input. I think it's a unique job being an MP, and it's often hard to understand the intricacies of what goes on. And I think that we are unique in the House because it's the only committee within the House that we have MPs and lay members, and we have equal weighting. So I think it's entirely right and proper that we have MPs on the committee, because I think we bring a knowledge and, dare I say, a wisdom to how things actually work and how it impacts us. And then we do have that counterbalance of the lay members from all different professions who bring their experience, their knowledge, and I think that is hugely valuable. And we've got the chair of the Standards Committee in the front row. I know you're going to be hearing from him next, Alberto Costa. And I know that Alberto would agree that that is really, really important, that we have that added sort of balance of outside people.
Absolutely. Before turning to some questions from the audience, Dave, I just wondered if you wanted to pick up on anything there, particularly this question about ensuring that those who are elected are sort of held to standards set by others who are elected, who have an understanding of what it means to do those kind of roles, while also ensuring that you kind of create the standards that you'd expect in any kind of professional modern workplace.
And Parliament, I think, is a really good example of this, because it came from quite a dark place on this, to be honest. It wasn't working, and self-regulation was not working. And you could see that, and it had to go through quite a difficult period to get round on the other side. And now, well, it's not a perfect model, I think, has demonstrated by some of the really difficult and tough decisions that have been taken, and some of the sanctions that have been posed, which have been quite significant, that it's got an appetite to do that. And there's been a balance struck not only on the committee around the lay and the members, but also around some of the processes around when Parliament as a whole has to get involved and take decisions, and the kind of delegation of authority around some of the sanctions that have happened. And so I think it is a good model. I will always, I think, prefer independent regulation. I think that works better. I understand all the things, the complexities around what happens in the nature of the work in Parliament. It will go back to a kind of constitutional bit about the independence of Parliament and self-regulation, all that kind of stuff. I think I would always say that I would prefer both in government and in Parliament and public institutions, independent regulation is better. I think it's better for politicians as well, to be honest, as well as for the public. But I do think actually what's happened in Parliament is a really good example of them learning lessons, getting some teeth around regulation, and then actually showing an appetite to regulate.
Yeah, brilliant, absolutely. And again, sort of building on that, I'm going to go to one of the questions online, which has come from someone anonymous to Melissa. You talked about an open door policy that you have in Stormont for politicians. This person asked, could you go into more depth about how this works, and is this the kind of culture we need to see at Westminster?
Well,
I think most commissioners have what's called an open door policy. I mean, anybody can email me or call me or come through my door. And, you know, I think it's definitely, how that works is you let them know that at induction, or you send out an email, all members email, and let them know. And I think instead of, you know, I think prior, maybe in the past, there was maybe a sense of fear of a commissioner investigating. That sort of, I always think that's a bad tone to set. And so I've always set out to just be, I'm an academic by background, so I dealt with medical students my whole entire career. So I'm used to, you know, having people pop in and have questions and just a lot of issues. So it's not that unusual, but I think it's unusual maybe for members, and I see them now, and the laugh is I feel bad saying hello to them because it might out them in the cafeteria. How do you know her? You know, so I'm hesitant to say hello. But anyway, it has its own issues. I mean, can I just pick up on what you said about the self-regulation bit? The self-regulation bit, as a commissioner, I quite like that level of self-regulation. I like the lay members. We don't have that in Northern Ireland.
Oh, right, okay.
But I do like that level. And I should probably say, and I know you were going to ask this question, but I'm the commissioner for Guernsey and Jersey as well. And they have two very different parliaments and two very different standards regimes. And just to pick up that one does have, they just did not want any member involvement in Guernsey. There's 60,000 people roughly. And they've decided they're going to have the commissioner, me, and then when it is when they can actually meet the grounds for an appeal, it goes to another commissioner. They opted for another commissioner, who they were very happy to get, the House of Lords Martin Jelly, who will be getting anything that comes his way that is appealable. And so that is extremely independent. I mean, I haven't had really a case to really give you any detail on yet, because there are very, very few complaints there. But I do think it's going to be interesting to see how that works, because I'm less comfortable. If I'm being honest, I'm comfortable with it, don't get me wrong, but I prefer the idea that you guys know what level you really want. You know, I do want high, right? But maybe you guys say, well, wait, remember about 10 years ago, this, that, or the other? You have a memory. I think that's important too. So anyway.
I absolutely concur, it is important. The other thing I would say is that because we are self-regulating, and obviously the MPs on the committee, it also sets that standard that people say, well, actually, you know, I've got my peers who are setting the standard. I have to maintain that standard, and that's really important. And obviously, where we've had complaints that have been referred to us and decisions have had to be taken, obviously the most egregious of those complaints have to then go to the floor of the House.
That's right.
And you know, your colleagues are making those decisions, and I think that sets I think that sets a really good tone, because it's actually saying, well, you know, we're your peers, and we think that you fell below the standards, and we're not happy with that. So I think that's really important.
And to tell you the truth, it does go to the House in Guernsey, but I think it's because of 60,000 people. They're really not thinking anybody could be totally independent.
Right.
And I think, so I quite like, I put them out there as the most independent, as a good thing. And I will say it is a good thing, but my preference is to understand your side of that,
I want to bring Roger in here, because I think there's something interesting about different levels of government. And someone online, again anonymous, has asked whether the standard system is prepared for the rise of reform in politics. And do we have an early sense of how they are coping on standards at local government level?
Yeah, thanks, Anon. I think I was, let me just say at the start, anything I'm saying on this is not specific to Kent. And I think it's important to say that for rather obvious reasons. And I have very deliberately, since the election, you know, kept what I hope is a sensible approach to these things, and not continued to be a participant when that came to a close. So I'm talking more generally, and I'm talking in terms of what is, if you like, in the public domain. I think there are a couple of challenges which will arise from this, and that was what I was hinting at the end of my remarks. One is quite simply that across the councils where you have had a change, you have a vast number of new councillors, who also, most of whom do not have experience of local government prior to this, or indeed, in many cases, political experience at all. So I think that whole process of, if you like, mass socialisation is going to be quite a big one. And that's something which is going to be a very important part of what happens. The second, and again, this is rather in the public domain, is the role played in this by the National Party. And I think that will be interesting. That is one reason why I think it perhaps plays into what we're seeing in terms of the review of the local government standards regime, which was taking place anyway. Because you will have questions there about by what code of conduct are people bound, how does that govern how they behave, and equally then, who actually is taking responsibility for that. So I think those are going to be a couple of the issues which arise. Now, what will be also interesting, and it's a much more general point, is that, and I sort of hinted at this earlier on, there has been a bit more, and I say again, this has been across the country, a bit more tension in the officer-member relationship and sometimes the sharpness within member relationships too over the last few years, for reasons which are not wholly apparent. Some of it, I think, is coming out of the pandemic. Some of it has meant that there's been a slightly sort of culture war issue about the question of who works from home and who doesn't. That has certainly come in there as a point of debate. And I think that has again generated a slightly different tone to things which you've got to take into account. That is, if you look at it, it's the sort of anti-blob mentality, if I could put it that way, is more of a factor on the right of politics, but not only, I would say that. You actually see it across the spectrum. So I think all those things mean that we're at an interesting inflection point as to how we look, and as it so happens that, as I say, we're looking at the moment, the government is looking at how you approach a standards regime which has changed over the years. So it went through a very prescriptive phase, particularly in the sort of early Blair years. The standards board, as there was at the time, was much criticised in the sense that what were often almost vexatious or politically motivated complaints were generated. The government itself, that Labour government, started to modify that, and then it was drastically changed in the early years of the coalition. Arguably, and I would tend to agree with that, elements of that went significantly too far as well. And we're trying to find a balance, but just at a point when, as we say, the climate has changed within councils, and therefore that it's very timely in a sense that sort of plays into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just raise a point with that? Because I don't think that's just an issue about local government. You know, I mean, we've seen that because people are looking at the election of reform in May, but you know, we saw in terms of that kind of approach to standards that's obviously the concern around with some parties and how they operate. We saw that in government in the Johnson regime. We saw where a standards regime which was entirely relying on the Prime Minister, if the Prime Minister was not prepared to enforce it, and indeed not just rule breaking around COVID, but in terms of things like enforcing the ministerial code, the entire system fell apart. And that system, in the main, is still there, although the independent advisor can launch investigations and can report stuff. All roads lead back to the Prime Minister. And if we have a Prime Minister, if we have a standard system is entirely reliant on that, imagine what would be like with another government where there's a Prime Minister whose views of those issues are such that they would just simply ignore the publicity that comes, which is essentially the thing that now is relying on a Prime Minister doing the right thing, that there'll be a report published to say that that minister was guilty or this issue was out there in the public domain, and that's supposed to enforce the Prime Minister to act. What do you do when politicians don't care about that, actually, and don't face an electoral consequence to ignoring those standards as well? And I think that's a thing that we've got to think about. Hannah was talking about, you know, fixing the roof while the sun's shining, right? Is that this government needs to think about the Ethics Commission. How do we kind of bulletproof our systems in government, whether it's local or central, against that sort of approach, regardless of the party that would be in power?
Absolutely. There's a lot more we could talk about. I would love to just keep talking, but I want to bring in the audience to ask some questions. So please raise your hand. I think we'll take them in groups of 3, and you can do the John Major trick of ignoring the ones you don't like.
There's 4 of us.
I know.
Full scope.
Behind.
Thank you very much to our expert panel, and it's really interesting to hear about the management of standards on the ground. But can I ask about standard setting? When it comes to interpreting the Nolan Principles, are there different priorities for the different nations of the United Kingdom? Or is there a case for saying that the enforcement of Nolan Principles would be stronger and easier if there was more collaboration across the various nations?
Well, thank you very much. Lady across the aisle and...
Thank you. It's Sarah Petit from the House of Commons Administration. Excuse my cold. I helped to establish the Parliamentary Behaviour Code and the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, and part of my current role is to try and embed that, the Behaviour Code in Parliament. And I'm struck by the fact that a lot of our focus has been on sanctions and processes and risk management when things go wrong, but it'd be much better if we got to a position where things didn't go wrong, and also there are a lot of, as Roger sort of mentioned, kind of lower level tensions which don't necessarily merit those processes. And my question is sort of twofold. It's so my view is that it's actually more effective when political leaders really drive and incentivise positive behaviour change. So have you done yourself or seen any kind of really positive examples of that, either from a behavioural or other ethical perspective? But also, are there particular kind of support that officials like me in the House could provide? Again, examples of anything good that you've seen elsewhere would be just really helpful for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And would you pass it to the...
Thank you very much. Harry Rich, Registrar of Consultant Lobbyists. The question posed to us is, how can politicians demonstrate ethical leadership? And I'm wondering whether part of that is actually, as leaders, imposing new standards for the future. So this goes back to this question of fixing the roof while the sun is shining, because we heard this morning from Sir John Major, but elsewhere, about lots of very good recommendations for improvement that everybody agrees on, but no government actually gets to tackle. I mean, I don't want to sound too sceptical or cynical, but I think a lot of change only happens in these areas when there's a crisis. So in my area, there was a lobbying crisis in 2012, legislation 2014, no change since, but it's not peculiar to my area of work. But I suppose the question really I'm posing is, what can be done to make people address, those who have the power to address, to make people address difficult questions now, often when there's no votes in it, to make sure that standards are maintained for the future?
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to try and divide these between the panel, but please do feel free to come in on any of them. So perhaps, Melissa, if we go to you first on the first question about more collaboration between different bits of the UK.
Very interesting. Thank you for that question, because as I've said, a couple different jurisdictions that I'm in, and I was recently the Acting Commissioner for Wales, and I happen to love the Welsh Code. But I think it's the most up-to-date code there is, which is why I love it, yeah. So I have been using that to benchmark the other codes in Jersey and Guernsey. When I answered, Jersey is currently, and there's a lot of member engagement, which is very promising. They're rewriting their code, they're reviewing the code. And what I did was just look at what is in the other codes in full and where is their gaps. And then it's up to you if you want to fill those gaps. But so the interesting thing is we're probably going to wind up with the Northern Ireland and Wales Code are similar, because the previous commissioner actually is now the Commissioner for Wales. So there's changes going on from his side of things. And Jersey and Guernsey are now going to have similar rule-based codes. And I do think the rules shouldn't be that different. I mean, I often think this. Should we really have that many different codes? Of course they have to be tailored, and the members have to own them. And members have to decide what is important to them in their jurisdiction and what they want in their code. That to me is really, really important for the buy-in. But I think we could and should be sharing more and have more collaborative approach to, standards in general. What is the acceptable standard? With allowing for that tailored approach as well, I think.
And that's a very IFG message. I mean, we strongly argue about the benefit of learning from the devolved governments and legislatures across a whole host of things. I think the UK government is perhaps the least good government in the UK at learning from the other governments that we have.
Come on that point. So if you look in Scotland, again, as a result of a crisis, Scotland, in terms of the ministerial code now, has a completely independent system.
Yeah.
So the decision to investigate is done independently. The decision on that investigation is done independently. The recommendation on sanctions is done independently. the First Minister retains the power as a First Minister around what that sanction would be, but up to that point, everything is done independently as a result of it. And that, again, is the sort of system I think we'd like to see and see other governments across the UK taking board.
Brilliant, thank you. Paula, do you want to come in on Sarah's question?
Yeah, Sarah, thank you for your question. I think it's really, really interesting. I think, as many things in life, if we go to a restaurant, for example, and we get good service, we don't really highlight it. But if we go to a restaurant and get bad service, we complain. So I think you're right in terms of the good examples, but it's not the good examples that stand out. It's always the bad examples that stand out. So I can't think of a really good example, but one of the interesting points you made was you mentioned about it being incentive. And we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing this job? Well, we should be doing this job because we're here to serve, and that should be our founding principle, or, that we live by. Why do I spend the majority of my week in London away from my family? Well, I do that because I believe in public service, and I think that is really, really important. And I think that's the only incentive that we should have. Obviously, the Prime Minister stated in our manifesto that we were going to have an independent ethics and integrity commissioner. We haven't yet delivered that. I think we should get on and do that. I think that's really, really important. I think that would be a great example of how we raise standards and raise confidence from the public. It's interesting that the Leader of the House, who leads the Modernisation Committee, has invited the Standards Committee to do an inquiry into second jobs and how that is perceived. And that's something that we're looking at currently. But I think in terms of incentives, we really need to ask ourselves why we would need any other incentive than to serve the public. And I am going to personally look for good examples now rather than the bad examples. So thank you for saying that, because I think that's really important.
I want to bring Roger in. Sorry, Melissa. I just interested in this last question, but I mean, reflections on any of them. But at this point about, do things only get fixed when there's a crisis, and what can you do in sort of quote unquote normal times to strengthen this system?
I think the point about it, it takes a crisis to force these things is probably almost inevitable, I fear, and that's a much wider point, clearly, than local government. And clearly, local government will not have, on the whole, the role in setting its own the framework. There's an element of this. Now, it will play a role. The LGA had its model code a couple of years ago, although that also actually came out of or reflected what had been a report from the Committee on Standards in Public Life. So I think that does, in a sense, tie in a little bit, if I'm thinking about my own experience and about local government, to, I think it was the second question, which is the role of leadership. Because I do think that what you can do is embed in the culture of the organisation certain expectations. And that is certainly, in my view, that was about, when I was leader, trying to set the tone. And that governed both member to member and member to officer relations. There are some real challenges in that, I would add, because there is a bit of inevitable tension between, particularly the member to officer thing, and you don't want to go down the track of becoming completely antiseptic and apolitical, and you will end up actually losing political credibility if you do. So there's an art form to that for a leader to get it right, and that's quite challenging. I think there are other elements too, which is, above all, being very clear on what behaviour you will and won't tolerate, and being actually pretty strict on that. And that is something that is very much within your gift, although there is a structure out there that should be able to take things forward anyway, but nonetheless the attitude of leadership on that is critical. So I think if you get those things right, you can embed certain things in the culture. There's a bit where you are slightly drawing on the sand, because whatever comes after you may change it. But to a degree, you can embed that. And as I say, the local government family collectively can play its part, working with bodies like CSPL to try and encourage certain things, even in the times when the sun is shining and you don't have an immediate problem.
Well, okay. Did you want to ask?
I just want to add something. I just think we can do more just than the internal. I think the media has a lot to do with this too. I think the media can promote really good behavior where they see it, instead of, well, of course they're always going to put the headline up with the bad behavior, but there is something about that that's really, really important. They are helping to undermine trust when somebody leaks a complaint to them that hasn't even been considered and it turns out to be inadmissible anyway, and you've already wrecked somebody's reputation. I think there's something about self-reflection on that end, but also then trying to be a source of good, to promote positive people who are working in hard enough jobs and doing positive news stories about the ethical leadership that they see. And even, what's to stop there being a reward or an incentive for ethical leadership in politics? Is there one? I don't know. But why can't there be one? And those are like things that can chip away and help, not chip away, but build trust. And aside from just the internal bits and the codes, the really solid codes and the solid legislation and all of that, I think there's a lot of prongs that you can attack this with that there's some that we're not using. And I think with the low level of trust, we need to think of those things, definitely.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to do one more round of questions in the room. If you would keep them quick, please.
Tom Brake from Unlock Democracy. Are there any areas where the panel thinks that Parliament could take action to help politicians have ethical leadership? For instance, I know the Committee on the Standards is looking at second jobs in terms of closing down areas where it has proven to be difficult to provide ethical leadership in the past. And are there any other areas apart from second jobs?
Thank you very much. Any more questions?
Morning, Kevin Armstrong from Full Fact, the UK's independent fact-checking organisation. Prime Ministers, past and present, have not corrected inadvertent errors that they've made in the Commons when asked. What should be done to remedy that? And do you think at the moment we're seeing the ethical leadership from people at the top of the cabinet that we should ideally expect in accordance with the principles?
Great, thank you very much. One more question over here.
Thank you, Marianne Overton, Vice Chairman, Local Government Association, leader of the Civility Group. What I'm wondering about is about the accusations that can sometimes be made without proper grounds, unfounded complaints that might be politically motivated. Is there a way in which that can be dealt with? Because if the process is clunky and takes a long time, it's not effective. Justice has to be swift and effective to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Roger, perhaps can I ask you to think about that last one?
Yeah, I will. And it's an interesting one because certainly some cases I have observed, and I'm not commenting whether they were unfounded or not. In fact, the one I'm thinking of was not unfounded, but it's slow. It's very slow, and the argument that justice delayed is justice denied, I think, is a very powerful one. So part of looking at the overall changes to the system has to look at the question of timeliness. I would hope, however, you're thinking about, because again, one of the things I think we're keen not to get back to is the world, as I said, of things like in the Standards Board in the 2000s, when you did have a lot of such complaints and it tied everything up. Hopefully, the role of the independent person there in getting the stuff chucked out, which is clearly vexatious early on and needs to be robust, I think that could well be an important part of it. So I think that's the balance we've got to strike. But I think at the moment we have a situation where there is a great deal of informality and, of course, variation across councils in terms of how it's applied. And I suspect the trend is actually going to be to make it somewhat more uniform. But I do think it needs to address that question that a process can be, and perhaps part of it is almost, in some cases, the lack of familiarity, the lack of use, because it's all fallen a little bit to desuetude. but it does need to be prompter at those early stages, and particularly throwing out the vexatious stuff early on, because there are issues of people's time, their ability to do their roles, and their reputations. And it actually can become another part of what dissuades people from public life.
Melissa, I wonder if there's anything you want to add on that about unfounded complaints, but also this point about getting ministerial leaders to correct the record. I don't know if this is something you deal with in Stormont.
Well, yes, I have actually. I've done a big investigation. You may have heard about it. First Minister was accused or alleged that she misled the committee for the executive office when she said she didn't see a member of the press standing where they were standing. It's a long story, but all I will say is that I think the most respected leaders that I know in Northern Ireland and Jersey and Guernsey are ones that they admit and correct the record and admit their failings right away and change and make sure because otherwise I think you're undermining the very institutions you're trying to serve. And so I think there is a big problem if people are not going back and correcting the record. And I've seen it many times in Stormont where the record's corrected, and in Jersey and Guernsey, and they have their own parliaments there, and they'd always, I've heard corrections quite often. So it shouldn't be, again, I think it's a source of strength to admit that you failed. It shouldn't be seen as something, the mistake you made should hands up. And you mentioned that before, Paula. I think that's the way we have to go here, to strengthen trust rather than condemn everybody for doing it.
Absolutely.
Paula, your thoughts on that point, and perhaps this point as well about what else Parliament can be doing to encourage politicians to show leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think justice delayed is justice denied, and in every organisation there will always be vexatious complaints, and there is issues. I know that the Commissioner receives lots of complaints that is not within his scope, and he has to, write back and say that and refer some, to the Independent Complaints and Grievance Service, the ICGS, which Sarah was talking about before, which deals with bullying and harassment and sexual misconduct. And as a Standards Committee, we are concerned at the length of time some of those ICGS complaints take. And that is something that we are looking on and obviously we are concerned about. In terms of anything else that we can do to provide further ethical leadership, I wouldn't really add anything other than I've said, Tom, that it's incumbent upon every single one of us to lead by example and demonstrate that we live to the values of the Nolan Principles each and every day. And as I said before, we will make mistakes, but it is about us putting our hands up. And if we have inadvertently led to the House, that we correct the record at the earliest possible opportunity. And that's something that Mr. Speaker is really keen for us to do. It's something that the Commissioner offers assistance and advice with. And I think that most colleagues want to do that themselves as well.
Well, thank you. Dave, last word to you. What's your view on, is there more that Parliament can do or should be focusing on, and what about this point about correcting the record?
I mean, I think on correcting the record, that whole issue of trust in politicians isn't just about behaviours, it's about those kind of elements as well, about what people look at with politicians and kind of self-interest. And the stuff that should really be easy wins for politicians, like that, where it's inadvertent, they absolutely should do, and there should be sanction. It should be sanctioned if they don't. I don't know why politicians seem reluctant to do that, but they do, and they need to think about their responsibility for all of politics in terms of people trust them. In terms of leadership, I mean, I was thinking more. I remember giving evidence to the Committee for Standards in Public Life when they were doing, I think it was the 25-year review, and they were talking about kind of the role of leadership. And the most senior public sector leader in the country is the Prime Minister. And I think, and so how the Prime Minister behaves on these issues, not just about his own behaviour, but the kind of tone that's set, the promises that are made around standards, when you have to make a difficult political decision to enforce standards, And also, do you fulfil your promises around driving up standards with the Ethics Commission? Really, inevitably, I think, sets the tone for all of the public sector, you know, for all politicians, because that's the most visible for the public, is seeing what happens in government and what happens around the Prime Minister. And I think that's where we could see, so not so much about Parliament. I think if Labour do something, we'll maybe find out later on about the Ethics and Integrity Commission. I remember coming here to hear Angela Rayner make that commitment, Labour, and I know there's a lot going on, there's always a lot going on, you know, but in the main, this thing's not coming with a cheque. It's actually just about standards and legislation and not necessarily about money, and it's something that they could do. And I think really driving that and demonstrating that this is a government that will hold itself to account is probably the most important thing that they could do. And that's the thing, you know, we've talked a bit about fixing the roof, but that sense of saying, actually, I'm prepared to hold myself to really high standards is a really important thing to demonstrate, as well as having a regime of standards which then will then survive the next election and election after that and election after that. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. We could keep going, but I've already run over. I just want to say, so please stay where you are, because we are going to be hearing from Alberto Costa, Chair of the Standards Committee, shortly. Then it'll be lunchtime, and then Nick Thomas-Symonds, Minister for the Cabinet Office, is going to give his speech, and we may find out what's going to happen. I just would like to end by asking you to join me in thanking the panel. Thank you very much.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the next session in our conference today. My name is Alex Thomas. I'm a Programme Director here at the Institute for Government, and I'm delighted to be joined for this session by Alberto Costa. Alberto is the Conservative Party MP for South Leicestershire. He's been Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Secretary of State for Scotland and to the Attorney General, but for our purposes today has an absolutely critical role in the standards framework, as having served on the Committee on Standards and the Committee of Privileges since 2019 and elected chair of both committees last year. Alberto is going to give a short speech, a few remarks. I'll then follow the usual form. I'll ask him a couple of questions, then we'll open out to the audience and get your questions in on Slido for those at home or indeed in the audience. So over to you, Alberto.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Alex, for your kind introduction. And it's good to see friends and work colleagues in the room this morning. And may I begin by thanking Hannah White and all her team here at the Institute for Government for hosting this timely and important summit on the Nolan Principles. Now, I don't know about you, but I am always slightly anxious when giving a talk or a speech about standards. And I'm even more anxious today when I reflect that it feels like only yesterday when the Nolan Principles were introduced. And yet here we are together, unbelievably 3 decades after they were first introduced. If I recall correctly, if I close my eyes, I think I was studying public and administrative law when these principles were first articulated. And I'm here 30 years later now attending a welcome conversation of marking 30 years of these principles underlining standards in public life. Now, Alex, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I will say at the outset that in fact, I'm going to give you a promise from a politician that I intend to end my short comments with a question for all of us. But before doing so, let us just recap on the bodies underpinned by the Nolan Principles that operate within and related to our parliamentary democratic environment, helping to ensure that ethics and standards as expressed by the Nolan Principles underpin our political system. Well, the Committee on Standards last year published its welcome landscape review of the many standards bodies within the UK Parliament. Hands up, how many of you read it? Come on, Dave, you must have read it as well. Well, here it is. It was Harriet Harman's final, as chair of the committee, final report. It's an excellent report. But the report highlights all the different standards bodies within the parliamentary system, and it may be helpful to all of us just to remind us how many checks and balances we already have in our parliamentary standard system. So I'm just going to list these off. The House of Commons Committee on Standards, and Paul and I are here today along with Susie, the second clerk of the committee, and the concomitant Code of Conduct. The House of Commons Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, who I understand is here as well. The House of Commons Clerk of the Journals. If anybody can tell me what that means, after 10 years as an MP, I'd be glad to hear. The House of Commons Committee of Privileges. The House of Lords Conduct Committee and its Code of Conduct. The House of Lords Commissioner for Standards. We've got 2 commissioners in Parliament. Parliament's Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme. Parliament's new Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme Assurance Board, only created in permanent footing on Monday evening. The Behaviour Code. Parliament's Independent Expert Panel. Parliament's Standards Act 2009, which helped create the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority and the Independent IPSA Compliance Officer. There's the Speaker's Committee on IPSA, of which I'm a statutory member. And then without Parliament, there's the Ministerial Code and the Prime Minister's Independent Advisor on Ministerial Interests. There's a Committee on Standards in Public Life, which we've got the distinguished chair of here today. And then there's the Electoral Commission and the Speaker's Committee on the Electoral Commission. So I don't think anyone would say that there aren't certainly a large array of bodies in Parliament that to one extent or another deal with standards regimes underpinned by the Nolan Principles. So these bodies do provide necessary checks and balances in our parliamentary system. Notwithstanding, why is it that parliamentarians are currently held in the very lowest esteem by the public? What is it that we, and by we I mean all of us with roles in the bodies that I've mentioned, and you too, as stakeholders with an interest in ethics and standards, what is it that we are all apparently or seemingly collectively failing on? Trust in our political system is so low that the electorate appear to be turning away from the established political parties, as we heard from in the former panel, as well as expressing a deep distrust in political and public bodies. And it appears that the public perceive populism as an answer to this. Now, my speech today is not party political, but it would be wrong in celebrating 30 years of the Nolan Principles to ignore the very real disquiet being expressed out there by the general public about their perception of standards in our parliamentary, political and wider public body system, such that they see populism and, more worryingly, radical systemic change as an answer. I think we must consider this if we hope to see a further 30 years of the Nolan Principles underpinning our varied standards system. After all, as we heard from John Major earlier today, it was because of public disquiet that in 1994 the Committee on Standards in Public Life was established, and that its original terms of reference were, and I quote, to examine current concerns. That's the very same public disquiet concerns in 1994 that we're now experiencing today, about standards of conduct of all holders of public office. Now, my specific role as chair of the Standards Committee of the House of Commons is extremely limited. Yes, important, but focused on three key areas. As chair, it's my responsibility, alongside Paula and the other members of that committee, to firstly recommend policy on the MP Code of Conduct and related matters to the House of Commons. We are, after all, a select committee. Uniquely, as Paula mentioned earlier on, we have 7 full voting independent lay members, in addition to the 7 MPs. And given that as chair I only have a casting vote, in practice that means were the committee to divide, it is the lay members who hold the majority. Now just think about that for a moment. I don't know of any other Western parliamentary system that has a select committee where lay members hold a majority. So although the committee rarely divides, it does prefer to operate on a consensual basis. Secondly, the committee has the very difficult duty and the frankly unenviable duty of adjudicating on potential breaches of the Code of Conduct when matters are referred to by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. And thirdly, the committee has the task of oversight for the office of the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. 3 different and difficult but important focused roles. So these focused roles help in our parliamentary system, and they help ensure that the parliamentary system has the Nolan Principles underpinning them. Now, I should add, as chair of the Committee of Privileges, a separate committee, that committee has the role of inquiring into privilege-related matters, but only referred to it by the House. Now, of course, the most seminal work that the committee undertook in recent times was the well-known case involving a former Prime Minister. And Dave Penman earlier alluded to that. And although trust is at an all-time low, it was heartening for me and the former clerk and others to read the opinions expressed by other representatives from Western parliaments about this seminal case, and indeed the guidance that some other allied parliaments have sought from me and those involved in the standard regime on how they might boost and enhance the standard system within their own parliamentary system. Yet, I repeat, public trust is simply not there. It is not there for our parliamentarians, and I'm afraid it appears to be lacking in the public's relationship with the wider public sector. Alex, I pledged at the outset to end with a question, and this politician, mindful of his obligations under the Nolan Principles, will at least honour that modest promise to help kickstart our discussion. So, to borrow Westminster Abbey Institute's own motto and turn it into a question for us to consider, I pose, how might we renew faith in public life? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alberto. And yes, a politician who delivers on their commitments. We can all applaud that, if not quite a manifesto promise achieved. But thank you very much for that. I wanted to pick up. It's diving into sort of one particular aspect, I suppose, of the question that you pose, but also your kind of the sight you have of the rise of populism and the forces that might be shaping politics over the coming years. But it was to look at one particular aspect of that, which is transparency. And it's always struck me that transparency is a bit of a double-edged sword. So we want transparency, and we want transparency in public life, and we want those in public life to be held to account. But it also potentially feeds, well, they're all in it together, they're all the same, a narrative about the kind of decline of quality or standards in public life. So how do you reconcile those kind of two sides of the transparency coin?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I know that Paul and I and others have been giving consideration to this. Look, sunshine is the best disinfectant. There's no doubt about that. However, as was said earlier, the environment that we live in, particularly in the United Kingdom, where we've got the remaining mainstream newspaper media really fighting and squeezing the juice out of the orange for any story that they can get their hands on, as well as the unwelcome rise of social media without proper discourse, I would give you two responses. So one of the standards body within our parliamentary system is IPSA, the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, and it was created rightly as a statutory body following the appalling abuse by some MPs of the previous costs and fees regime. Now, IPSA has been in existence for 15 years, and as a statutory member of the Speaker's Committee on IPSA, I welcome the change that they've very recently introduced in terms of transparency at granular detail. So up until very recently, they would routinely disclose every single costs claim that an MP makes. But they've come to realise that in so doing automatically, unfortunately, rather than giving more confidence through that transparency to the public, what has happened is two things. Number one, the public, through the mischief of some elements of the media, mistakenly think that an MP claiming, for example, toilet rolls for a constituency office for staff is claiming expenses for their own toilet rolls. And so MPs, the second issue is that MPs unfortunately have been politically dissuaded from making entirely legitimate and proper cost claims for fear of being misrepresented through the mischief of social media and some mainstream media organisations. So IPSA has decided that it is no longer disclosing the granular details of claims under a certain amount. Now, that does not mean that these claims will not be subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. They will be, and IPSA will have to still disclose those claims. But the point here is IPSA has recognised that in this instance, sunshine might not, in fact, be the best disinfectant because it creates the mischief of a misrepresented legitimate claims that MPs should be making. So that's one example that I would give. I think the second example of transparency, and I just pose this without expressing a view, is if you look at the bulk of issues involving MPs and code of conduct breaches, I just pose the question to the audience. If an MP has never breached the code of conduct and has wholly inadvertently failed to disclose, for example, a lunch that the IFG might have taken an MP out for, and failed to disclose that within the strict 28-day limit, and a complaint is made, and the process goes through what's called the rectification, a document is published, and the public are made aware that the MP breached that code. I think, or I ask the audience to think, are the public able to distinguish a breach of that sort from, say, a breach involving corruption, of which we've had a few in the last Parliament, or we've had one egregious corruption? So I pose that to the audience. Is that level of transparency, again, is it helping the public have faith in the standard system in Parliament, or does it give the misleading impression that MPs who really commit a very modest, inadvertent administrative breach are concatenated with the same MPs that commit much more serious breaches?
Thank you. There's a question online actually that touched on something I was going to ask on too. So you listed all those many standards bodies. Anonymous asks, are there plans to produce a standardised approach for MP misconduct? Quite a few similar cases, they claim, of misconduct were handled very differently depending on the MP's influence, tenure, popularity and party. I was reflecting as you were going through that list as well of, I suppose the question is, have we incrementally accrued too many bodies? There was an understandable, I think, reaction to the expenses scandal where MPs hadn't taken the principles-based Nolan approach, or not holding the damaging the reputation of the House of Commons or whatever, to move towards codification. Is the weight of different bodies, too heavy now in your view, or not? And is there an opportunity for more systematisation, I suppose?
So if I may refer once again to this excellent document that Harriet Harman and the previous committee produced. So there is an organogram in this report, and the organogram highlights the principal bodies, which I've tried to list as many of them as possible. There are more arrows here, it would appear, than in the bio tapestry in terms of who does what. Nobody in their right mind today, if they had a blank sheet of paper, would create this. But this is what we've got. This is what we've had organically. And the committee did look to trying to simplify this, and it concluded that it just can't. It's not that easy to do because it would create a whole host of unintended consequences. However, I mean, Dave Penman's point earlier about a statutory body being created, I've been on public record saying that I'm quite sanguine about that. I mean, I think that having a statutory body might actually be better for the complainant as well as the respondent, because it takes away privilege, number one, and much more importantly, it makes it justiciable. So if either the complainant or the respondent are unhappy with the outcome of a statutory regulatory body, they can go to court. We can't do that at the moment. Now, you might think, well, that's because of the Bill of Rights and da-da-da-da-da. But actually, Parliament did create a statutory body called IPSA. And the safeguard that MPs have with IPSA, and indeed any entitled party, is that if IPSA's, let me give you an example, if they had a sort of post office type computer scandal, if they accused me or any other MP of fraudulent claims, ultimately I've got that ultimate safeguard of going to the court and saying, seeking judicial review of that body. And so I think there is an argument that Dave highlighted of potential creation of a statutory body which would no longer have privilege and which would be justiciable. But of course there's a lot of vested interests in Parliament, and Parliament rightly wants to guard jealously its Bill of Rights protections and its privilege, but it's certainly a debate I'd be willing to have with the trades unions and others.
Thank you. Really quick, last one from me, but I couldn't resist asking this, and you mentioned yourself that you were in the middle of a difficult standards issue in the last Parliament with a certain former Prime Minister. I wanted to ask about just the human level. How did it feel? You don't need to go into the whys and wherefores again, which have been well aired around the Johnson issues, but you were in the middle of a sort of pressure cooker during that issue. How did you respond to that personally? How did you as a parliamentarian work out how to navigate your way through that set of issues?
I had a brief chat with the Westminster Abbey Institute yesterday. They raised the issue of moral courage, and we're having a committee gathering next week about this. I think the only two people, aside from myself, that can understand what I and some other Conservative members went through on that committee is, in my case, it's my wife and Harriet Harman. The two of them really understood the pressure that we were under. My head was on the chopping block. It was about whether or not, the abuse that I received through the national media, through social media, from somebody that I wasn't standing to be leader of my party, the sort of type of scrutiny and investigation that you would get if you wanted to be leader of a party or Prime Minister. It was appalling. And it was extremely difficult. And there was also an element of temptation, I think I'm going to be quite frank, because if you we have an adversarial system and you want to beat the opposite party. If I had allowed temptation in, then you might act in a way which lacks moral courage and which might result in some personal enrichment in terms of, well, if an outcome here is in favour to the person being investigated, that person might return to power, and who knows if I might then be appointed a minister. It's entirely human to have thoughts of that ilk, but it would be very wrong to adjudicate on that basis. But unless you've gone through a process like that, and I had never in my previous profession as a solicitor ever put my head on the block to that extent. But unless you've gone through that, you don't really understand the toll it takes on your mental health and well-being.
Thank you for that. Really appreciate that answer, and I can tell the audience did as well. So, questions from the audience. Let's go to Ian at front there. Susanna, the microphone.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Alberto. If I may, I just want to kind of come in on what we've just discussed, and I want to thank you and the others on that committee for what they did. And I remember, when you and I are friends, let's be honest about that. And I remember the kind of thing that you went through. And I think just reflecting on that from a standards perspective, we're only as good as the people that were on that committee. And the point about that is that every single person on that committee, irrespective of the party they represented, did the job that they were there to do. And the pressure that you were under, Alberto, was immense. And we should be very grateful to the members of the Privileges Committee, the Standards Committee, and so on. But we've kind of touched on this issue of populism and what could change going forward. And I think the key question that comes out of that for me is, how do we future-proof the standards landscape, particularly in that parliamentary concept, given the changes that could take place. But that example of what that Privileges Committee did is something that we should be proud of in our democratic political system. And those that are members of select committees, not just the Privileges Committee and the Standards Committee, but those that are on committees understand that when they're on those committees, they've got a job to do to uphold our our democracy. And what you did in that committee, what you personally did, was the finest example of that you could find.
Thank you. I'll take a few questions and then we'll have to wrap up. So we'll go to Duncan there, and then
Duncan Hames, Transparency International UK, and our appreciation to all of the members of your committee, MPs and lay members, for the important work that they do. Listening to you talk about that very pressured situation regarding to partygate, I also thought of what was really quite shocking at the time, and I think it was the chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life that was speaking here at the Institute for Government the following day after members of Parliament were told by the whips not to support the committee's decision on the Owen Paterson case. I wonder if you could tell us what that felt like for those of you working on the committee, and do you have would you like to take this opportunity to tell the whips what you think about them sticking their noses into the committee's business?
praise and temptation there. I think there was a question from the woman just behind you, to your right, yeah.
Thank you. Morning. I'm Edge Watchell, the director of Westminster Abbey Institute, and we have heard that our purpose is renewing faith in public life. Some of the work we do takes place in public, some of it is more private and discreet, so we offer spaces where parliamentarians and leaders in other public service organisations can reflect very openly and honestly about some of the challenges they face in taking moral and ethical decisions, and actually the dilemmas around that. And it very much focuses on some of that human cost of leadership in public life. One of the things that often comes out of those conversations is a recognition that there are not many spaces where people feel they can talk about these things really, really openly. And I wonder, Alberto, what your thoughts are on how we might normalise some of that conversation. How do we encourage cultures in our public service organisations where it is okay to talk about some of the human cost of public service within the context where it's recognised that it's difficult, it's challenging, that multiple seemingly conflicting things can be true at the same time, and how might we nourish and resource public servants to be able to reflect on that more openly within those sorts of contexts.
Thank you. So 3 sort of linked questions in a way. So finding the spaces to talk about these things. Ian's question about future-proofing, and then an opportunity to unleash on what happened around Owen Paterson.
So Ian, thank you for your comments, and I do miss you in the House of Commons. If only that I can't wag the finger at you. But look, nothing is perfect, and we should never seek perfection, because we don't want to make perfection the enemy of good. We have a system that is working, and I think Paula was saying earlier on about, Paul and I have discussed this, how do we promote the good work that we do as a committee, that the Parliamentary Commissioner does and his team, and all the other bodies that they do? It's very, very difficult persuading the media to put out good news stories. They're not interested in that. They're interested in the more salacious details. And well, that's fine, free country. But statutory footing, I think, is a potential. I'm not suggesting it is the answer, but I think that if you want to rationalise all of this, you could have one parliamentary commissioner for the whole Parliament, one behaviour code, nuanced, take into account the 2 houses, an expedited tribunal system, judges involved. You know, we've got electoral courts, for example, that are expedited. It's not beyond the wit of man and woman to come up with a system which could create an expedited system that deals with the A to Z of standards issues, and where both complainants and respondents feel that the laws of the land are being applied to what ultimately is workplace disputes. These are not, by their nature, privileged parliamentary disputes. If somebody's corrupt in Parliament, or if somebody's a bully in Parliament, corruption and bullying happens in any workplace. So I don't necessarily see why it has to be an internal system. I think the way to safeguard the Bill of Rights is that you can go through that process and make sure that both houses ultimately sanction whatever the findings of the tribunal are. But it would cost much more money than the current system that we have. Much more money. But I'd be up for that debate. I'd be up, this turkey would vote for Christmas, and I'd divest the role of adjudicating function for the Committee on Standards. I think the committee could remain as a Select committee setting policy. But I think adjudicating can go. That's something that I've long argued, wholly unsuccessfully. I think, is it Duncan? Duncan, Transparency International. I think, well, I think we all agree that the whips did the wrong thing in that case. I was appalled. But I throw back to you, we have an adversarial system, and broadly that's good. You know, we're very proud of the traditional parliamentary system that we've got here of challenging and scrutinising those in powers. But it's very difficult to work together. And I thought that COVID-19, if that wasn't an issue to bring the parties together, nationally and at devolved level, I don't know what was. I wrote to the leaders of each of the devolved nations, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, and only Nicola Sturgeon had the courtesy to respond to me. I'm thinking this is a time where we should knock heads together. So we live in an adversarial system. We've always had this. How we moderate that so we get higher quality intellectual policy debate without it descending to the pathetic sound bites that you trade over the dispatch boxes, I don't know. But I very rarely indulge in that sort of infantile behaviour. On Edge, leadership, the public sector, as I mentioned in my short comments, I mean, I get constituents all the time. They're coming in wholly distrustful of the public sector. I mean, the public sector worked jolly hard. I used to be a civil servant. I worked at the Treasury Solicitor's Office, as it was. And so, you know, I've seen it from both sides. But there is distrust. There's real distrust. And if we're not careful, if we don't come up with an answer to this, in 48 months' time, there could be a very different parliamentary outcome to the next election, which will have, by all accounts, a very different perspective on what breaking eggs to make an omelette means. So I pose that question back to you.
Posing the questions, Alberto. That's great. Now, I'm going to wrap it up there, but before we thank Alberto, I have some admin, so apologies for that. But we're going to have a slightly shortened lunch break, which we'll have now. Be back here at 1:25 for Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, who will have a short session then, and then there'll be another short break after that before we move into the sort of full afternoon programme. But thank you very much indeed, Alberto. That was great.